Hey guys, tonight we're plunging deep into one of the most bizarre and persistent rumours in all of history. It's a story that starts in palaces of icy grandeur, full of velvet drapes, scheming courtiers and gold leaf ceilings, but ends in whispered gossip about horses, scandal, and a sex rumour that absolutely refuses to die. And just to set expectations, you probably won't survive this. Not because you're in danger, don't worry, but because by the time we're halfway through, your jaw will have permanently relocated to the floor. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and what city are you falling asleep in tonight? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journeys together. You begin in the cold. Snowflakes fall like powdered sugar across the rooftops of St. Petersburg. It's the 1740s, and Russia isn't just a place, it's an empire barely hanging together by czarist ambition and bone-cracking winters. Outside the city palaces, life is raw and brutal. Inside, you're navigating chandeliers, dueling nobles, an intrigue so dense it practically has its own gravitational pull. And in the middle of it all is a teenage girl named Sophie. She's not Russian, not even close. She's from a small German principality called Anhalt-Zerbst, so tiny that if you blink at it on the map it disappears. Her family is noble, sure, but not specially important. Yet here she is, getting invited to marry into the Russian royal family. Why? Politics, mostly. Her mother is ambitious and well-connected, and the Russian Empress, Elizabeth, is looking for a wife for her awkward, oddball nephew, Grand Duke Peter, your Sophie, 14, maybe 15. You've never seen snow like this. You arrive in Russia bundled in wool, your boots sinking into fresh powder as you step out of the carriage and into the rest of your life. The court is watching you, measuring your every move. You're quickly baptized into the Orthodox Church, your name is changed to Catherine, and you're expected to transform into the perfect Russian noblewoman practically overnight. It's like auditioning for a part in a play you've never seen, in a language you barely speak. But here's the thing, you're brilliant, sharp as a tack. You learn Russian so fast it freaks people out. You read everything, you charm the Empress, you flatter the guards, you smile at the right moments. And while your new husband, Peter, is off playing with toy soldiers and talking to portraits of Frederick the Great, you're getting to know everyone in the palace who actually holds power. Catherine isn't just learning how to survive, she's learning how to win. One historical fact you can't ignore here. Russia at this time is deeply unstable. The line of succession is a mess. The nobles are hungry for influence. The military has the real power, and the people, well, they're just trying not to freeze or starve. But amid all that chaos, Catherine's positioning herself as the steady hand, the brain behind the beauty. She's laying the groundwork for something bigger, much bigger. Quirky, in fact. Catherine becomes obsessed with self-improvement, like full-on Enlightenment fangirl. She starts writing memoirs as a teenager. She reads French philosophy in bed. She practices smiling in the mirror. This isn't a girl who's just playing dress-up in royal robes. This is someone meticulously designing an empress from the inside out. Now, about the marriage, it's not good. Peter is weird. Not dangerous yet. Just weird. He's immature, cruel, in that petty way insecure people often are, and openly disrespects Catherine in front of the court. He's obsessed with all things Prussian, even though Russia just went to war with Prussia. Bad look. Meanwhile, Catherine, she's not just enduring it. She's studying it, cataloguing weaknesses, playing the long game. But people notice. Rumours start early. About her intellect, her ambition, and yes, even her sex life. The Russian court is a tangled net of spies and gossip. Nothing is private. Servants report to advisors, who report to nobles, who report to rivals. What you eat, when you sleep, who you look at a second too long, it all ends up in someone's letter or ledger. And the wildest part? Even at this young age, Catherine gets it. She understands that image is power. If you're going to be whispered about anyway, you might as well control the whispers. Here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Historians argue about whether Catherine was already plotting a coup from the moment she arrived in Russia, or if it was something she grew into. Was she always playing chess while Peter played checkers? Or did the broken marriage and the court's cruel politics slowly forge her into the strategist she became? You'll get historians on both sides of that argument, each waving letters and diary entries as evidence. But one thing is certain. You're in the middle of a royal court where ambition is a survival instinct. Catherine, still in her teens, is learning to navigate a political ecosystem that eats the weak alive, and she's not getting eaten. Instead, she's growing more powerful by the day, finding allies in unexpected places, and, perhaps most importantly, learning how to mask fire with elegance. You, future Empress of Russia, have arrived. You just don't have the crown. Yet. So now you're Catherine. Well, technically still Grand Duchess Catherine Eyre, a teenager with a sharp brain and a failing marriage. Living under the suffocating weight of expectation in a court where failure isn't just embarrassing, it's deadly. Your husband Peter is still obsessed with toy soldiers, parading them across tabletops while humming German marches. He mocks you, ignores you, and sometimes confides in his pet dogs more than in you. The only thing more disappointing than your wedding night is literally every night after that. Still you stay, you smile, you've filled your weight. The Russian court is brutal but not blind. Everyone sees what's happening behind those palace doors. Whispers echo like footsteps down the stone corridors. The Grand Duke hasn't touched her. She's reading French philosophy again. He's drunk by noon. She's writing in that little notebook again. You're becoming the subject of every conversation, and for a woman in your position, that can either make you or destroy you. Here's your reality. You have to produce an heir. That's your main job. No heir, no security. And Peter, bless his incompetent heart, can't be bothered. There's debate among historians about whether he was physically incapable, emotionally disinterested, or just wildly bad at sex. Maybe all three. Whatever the case, it puts you in a dangerous spot. Elizabeth, the Empress, is losing patience. The court is watching your belly for signs of swelling like it's a national weather forecast. Eventually, Catherine makes a calculated decision. And by calculated, we mean she starts making her own choices about how that heir is going to happen. You take a lover, Sergei Saltykov, a dashing Russian nobleman with enough charm to make the whole thing feel almost romantic. Emphasis on almost. Was it love? Maybe. Was it survival? Definitely. 9 months later, you give birth to a son. Paul, technically Peter's son, technically, the court breathes a sigh of relief, and Catherine's position becomes a little safer, a little more solid. You've done your job, sort of, but behind the scenes, people talk. Everyone knows Peter didn't father that baby. He knows it too, but he doesn't care. He's too busy reenacting imaginary battles and idolising Frederick of Prussia. And he's definitely not in love with you. Catherine, on the other hand, is evolving. You've gone from quiet observer to quiet operator. You're forming alliances, not with the simpering ladies-in-waiting or the gossipy noble wives, but with military officers, foreign diplomats, and key members of the court, people with power, people with loyalty, people who one day might help you do something bigger. Here's your historical fact. In the 1750s, Russia is a superpower in progress. It's enormous, sprawling across Europe and Asia, but culturally torn. The old guard clings to Eastern Orthodox tradition, while the younger elite are reading French Enlightenment literature and dreaming of constitutional monarchy. Catherine sees both sides and starts building a bridge between them. Not literally, but intellectually, philosophically. She writes essays, letters, and begins cultivating her image as an enlightened thinker. Not just a royal figurehead, but a mind to be reckoned with. And you want a weird detail? You keep pet squirrels. Seriously. Catherine is gifted squirrels, multiple, dressed in tiny outfits. You write thank you letters for them. Apparently this was a thing. Royal women and fashionable rodents. Don't ask. Anyway, back to your hellish marriage. Peter finally ascends the throne when Empress Elizabeth dies in 1762. He becomes Peter III, and just like that, you're officially the Empress Consort of Russia. It should feel like a triumph. Instead, it feels like walking into a slow-moving train wreck wearing a satin gown. Peter is a disaster as Tsar. He pulls Russia out of the war against Prussia, praises Frederick the Great, Russia's literal enemy, and generally alienates the army, the court, and anyone who liked his aunt. Within months, he manages to annoy almost everyone, including you. You realise it's now or never. You have allies, you have leverage, you have options. What happens next is the stuff of palace legend. While Peter's off at his summer palace playing soldier with his drinking buddies, you're coordinating a coup. You wake up early one July morning, ride to the military barracks, and appear before the troops in full regalia. You deliver a speech, you hold a cross, you pledge yourself to Russia. The soldiers, they cheer, they swear loyalty, they march with you. Peter doesn't even fight, he surrenders. A few days later, he's dead. Officially, it's called hemorrhoidal colic. Unofficially, he's probably murdered by your allies. Grigory Orlov, your current lover and one of the coup's masterminds, is widely believed to have orchestrated it. Do you order the hit yourself? Scholars still debate that. Some say you couldn't risk letting Peter live. Others argue you were too politically savvy to get your hands that dirty. One thing's for sure, he is out of the picture. Now take a breath, you've done it. You're not just empress by marriage, you're ruler in your own right. Catherine II, Empress of all the Russias. You've seized the throne without a single battle, without blood in the streets. It's the boldest move any woman in European history has pulled off to that point, and somehow you make it look graceful. And yet you're not celebrated. Not universally. Especially not by the men who see power as their birthright. Behind the accolades and court ceremonies there's unease. You're not just a ruler, you're a woman ruling alone. Dangerous, unnatural, according to your enemies, probably immoral. This is where the seeds of your future scandal begin to grow. You've taken lovers, you've had political enemies killed or exiled, you've outmaneuvered generals, diplomats and monarchs. In the minds of those who can't imagine a woman ruling without being wicked, there has to be something monstrous about you. And that's where the rumours start, not just whispers, but the slow, sticky drip of sexualised slander that will cling to your name forever. So you've done it. You've pulled off the quietest coup in Russian history, and now you're sitting on the imperial throne in a gown that weighs more than most infants. Catherine II, Empress of Russia, ruler of nearly 1/6 of the world's landmass, mistress of ice and fire and deeply uncomfortable court shoes. Outside, church bells ring and nobles kiss the hem of your dress. Inside, you're already planning your next move, because power isn't a moment, it's a job, and yours has just begun. But let's pause and acknowledge the mess you just climbed out of. That marriage? A fever dream of dysfunction. Your late husband Peter, may he rest in, well, pieces, was about as suited to leadership as a chicken in a fur hat, and yet, even in death, he haunts your image. Whispers at court asked, did she have him killed? Was she sleeping with his murderer? Did she orchestrate the whole thing from her powder room? You don't answer. That's the power move. Let them wonder. The Russian court, however, doesn't stop wondering. They watch everything. Your expressions, your diet, your bedtime routines, but especially your lovers. Oh yes, your personal life has now become a national pastime. This is where the weird royal surveillance culture comes into full view. It's like living in a palace with 400 roommates, all of whom have a quill, parchment, and a direct line to the gossip column. You can't sneeze without someone writing a letter about it. So when it becomes obvious that the Empress has a new favourite, boom, the chatter explodes like champagne on Coronation Day. Here's your historical fact. As ruler, you adopt a very structured approach to romance. You don't just date. You appoint. You pick favourites, a very official sounding term for your boyfriends. These aren't flings, they're trusted advisors, often given titles, estates and a job in your administration. They're part lover, part confidant, part cabinet member. It's like Tinder meets a royal resume review. One of your first major favourites is Grigory Orlov. Yes, the same Orlov who helped you stage the coup. He's tall, burly, a war hero with a famously explosive temper and a soft spot for your pet dog. Romantic, sure, strategically useful, even at better. He becomes the public face of your new reign, standing beside you like a Russian Hercules with better table manners. But there's a cost, because every time a new man enters your life, the court gets crueler. She can't rule alone, they whisper. She needs a man to think for her. And so every favourite becomes proof to your enemies that you aren't strong but weak, that you're not an empress, but a nymphomaniac in a crown. And here's where things take a turn from annoying to outright bizarre. As your list of lovers grows, slowly, methodically, and with almost embarrassing competence, the tone of the gossip shifts. No longer just whispers about affairs or favouritism. Now the stories are darker, more fantastical, the beginnings of a mythos. Because if you're a woman with power, and you like sex, the world will bend itself into knots to make you monstrous. Meanwhile, you're too busy actually ruling to care. Russia, under your command, starts shifting from a brittle medieval backwater into a forward-looking European empire. You promote education, establish new schools and codify laws. You write letters to Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, impressing them with your philosophical debates. You're drafting plans to end serfdom. Spoiler. They don't go as planned, but the effort makes waves. You even flirt with the idea of constitutional reform, until a massive peasant uprising snaps you back to autocracy like a rubber band. Quirky fact of the night. You once commissioned a life-size mechanical peacock for your court dinners. A literal robot peacock built in Switzerland, whose tail fanned open with clockwork precision. Nothing says casual Wednesday like serving roast duck while a robotic bird struts across the silverware. But back to the men. Orlov fades from your favour after several years. He gets sloppy, too comfortable. There are rumours of affairs. You're disappointed. Not heartbroken. You're already moving on, already scouting new talent like a seasoned coach. But each transition feeds the fire. The people want to believe there's something abnormal about you, too powerful, too confident, too satisfied. And satisfaction in a woman, especially one who rules, must be punished. Enter the early rumours, caricatures, utter mostly of your supposed insatiable appetite. Whispers that you had entire rooms built for your pleasures, that your lovers had to be evaluated for stamina, that you were using state funds to support your bedroom hobbies. None of it's true, or at least not the way they say it. Yes, you have lovers. Yes, you care about attraction and connection, but your relationships are complex, often deeply political, and always layered with power. You're not just picking hot guys off the royal tree, you're recruiting allies, building loyalty, managing egos. Still, the myths grow, court artists get bold, satirists in France draw cartoons showing you in, shall we say, compromising positions. The images circulate underground. Clergy members clutch their pearls. Moralists call you depraved. And yet, you keep ruling. With brilliance, with ambition, with silk-wrapped steel. Now let's dip into scholarly debate territory. There's a long-standing academic split over how to interpret your private life. Some historians see your series of favourites as feminist, asserting control in a world that wanted to control you. Others argue it was a vulnerability, a chink in your armour that allowed rivals to undermine your credibility. There's even disagreement over how many lovers you actually had, 12, 50, 100. Most modern scholars agree that the number is probably closer to a dozen serious relationships across a very long life. Hardly scandalous by any modern metric. But in 18th century Europe, that number might as well be 1,000, especially when it's you, a woman, doing the choosing. And so the narrative builds, piece by piece, rumour by rumour. You're becoming two people, Catherine the Great, Empress of Enlightenment, builder of cities, reformer of laws, and Catherine the other, the seductress, the libertine, the woman who, according to some, will eventually go to such extremes that her death becomes the punchline of history's dirtiest joke. You don't know it yet, but the most absurd, grotesque rumour of all, the horse, has already begun its slow canter into the back alleys of gossip, and it's coming straight for your legacy. So here you are, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, ruler of 250 million acres, commander of armies, pen pal to philosophers, and the unchallenged sun around which your glittering court orbits. You're renovating palaces, founding schools, expanding the empire, and staying up late to rewrite criminal codes by candlelight, and yet, what the people really want to know is, who's in your bed? Let's be real, if you were a man, no one would care, so you could parade your mistresses around like seasonal fruit baskets. The historians would just nod and call it dynastic vigour. But you're not a man. You're a woman. One ruling alone, without a husband, without a king by your side. Which makes you, in the eyes of your enemies, either unnatural or dangerous, or both. Enter the bedroom spies. Not a metaphor, literal agents reporting back to your political rivals with juicy tidbits about your personal life. Servants are bribed, ladies in waiting are leaned on. Anyone with eyes and a mouth becomes a potential informant, and their favourite topic, hands down, is your romantic preferences. This is the part where your love life turns into a circus tent with no exits. There's no such thing as privacy. If you smile too long at a handsome guard, rumours fly. If a letter arrives with a wax seal from someone young and dashing, people assume you're already halfway undressed. Worse, your own past favourites, men you trusted, elevated, maybe even loved, start leaking stories. Embellished ones, sometimes even invented ones. Historical fact time. Catherine maintained a discreet yet official system of managing her romantic companions. Each favourite was carefully chosen, sometimes vetted by close confidants like her lady-in-waiting, Countess Bruce, and often placed in official government roles to justify their proximity. It was a strategy that walked the line between personal indulgence and statecraft. Efficient, practical, and of course scandaleux if you chose to see it that way. And oh, people chose to see it that way. The French press, never a fan of any monarch not named Louis, devoured your affairs like pastries, pamphlets, cartoons, underground satires. They drew you as a lioness in heat, a she-wolf, a throne-straddling Medusa. One particularly charming print shows you reclining naked on a bed of muskets while Russian soldiers fan you with battle flags. Subtle, right? But let's zoom in on the court for a moment. Not France, not England, not the philosophers in their powdered salons. The Russian court, the very people you rule. This is where the gossip starts growing legs and claws, because this isn't just about sex, this is about control. Your latest favourite, Stanisław Poniatowski, is a Polish nobleman you fall for hard. Young, elegant, full of idealism, he becomes not just your lover, but your pet political project. You install him as King of Poland, literally. You help rewrite Poland's constitution. You try to strengthen the nation as a buffer zone against Prussia and Austria. And for a minute, it almost works. Then it doesn't. The nobles revolt, foreign powers intervene, Poland crumbles, and so does your relationship. You're furious. At him, at them, at yourself. The court whispers, "She let love cloud her judgment." You'd laugh if it weren't so infuriating. As if male rulers haven't started whole wars over women or pride or someone insulting their horse. Speaking of horses, no, not that yet, but they're coming. You can almost hear the hooves. Let's take a detour into a particularly odd moment. The delivery of an erotic spoumie. There's a story, possibly true, possibly exaggerated, that you once commissioned a life-size statue of yourself in the nude, reclining like a Greco-Roman goddess. Supposedly it was placed in a private wing of the palace. Some say it was sculpted by Falconet, the same artist who made the massive equestrian statue of Peter the Great. Others claim it was a gift. Either way, it becomes one of the first seeds in the garden of myth that will eventually bloom into full-blown absurdity. Now, here's your quirky fact of the night. The Russian court had a tradition of dressing palace cats in tiny military uniforms. This was a real thing. There were entire processions with cats dressed as generals, complete with miniature sabres. If that doesn't tell you what kind of absurd, over-the-top environment we're dealing with, nothing will. Anyway, back to you. You're getting older now. Not old, just seasoned. Wise. You've been ruling for over 2 decades. You've survived revolts, betrayals, wars and heartbreaks. And yet, with every new favourite, every promotion of a handsome courtier, the gossip resets. Like clockwork. "She's got a new one," they say. "This one's barely 20. She's insatiable. She's depraved." And here's the debate that rages even among modern historians. Was this court obsession with your sex life an intentional political weapon, or just the byproduct of old-fashioned misogyny? Some scholars argue it was orchestrated, carefully designed slander to delegitimize your rule. Others say it was spontaneous, a natural reaction from a patriarchal society that simply couldn't process a powerful sexually autonomous woman without turning her into a freak show. You're not helping matters by continuing to elevate new favourites. There's Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, a pretty boy singer whose only real qualification is being really, really pretty. He sings for you at dinner. You melt. He gets a government post. Then there's Alexander Lanskoy, another young officer. So young, the court jokes you could be his mother. But he's loyal, gentle, kind. When he dies suddenly of diphtheria, you're inconsolable. For once, the court hushes. Even they understand grief. But the pause doesn't last. The rumours return. The satirists sharpen their pens. And somewhere in the velvet-draped salons of Paris or the smoke-filled chambers of St. Petersburg, someone starts saying it out loud for the first time. She'll sleep with anything, even a horse. There it is. The first beat of the most infamous, stupid, enduring sex rumour in world history. No proof, no source, just a vile whisper, passed from man to man until it becomes folklore. And by the time it reaches the ears of your critics in Europe, it's already sprouted into a full-blown legend. That you didn't just have lovers, that you didn't just crave power, but that your desires were so unnatural, so monstrous that no man could satisfy them. And you turn to animals. It's grotesque, it's impossible, it's fiction, but it sticks. Because nothing terrifies your enemies more than the idea of a woman who can't be controlled. So they rewrite your desire into depravity, your power into perversion, your strength into scandal, And they do it with the oldest, cheapest tool in the book, shame. Let's be honest, by now you've done more than most monarchs manage in a lifetime. You've reshaped an empire, dragged Russia into the modern age by its frost-bitten collar, and somehow managed to do it all while your court counted the number of young men leaving your bedchambers like it was the imperial census. But tonight, the room is quiet. You're in your chambers, surrounded by velvet walls and flickering candlelight, and somewhere, probably over cheap wine and cheaper morals, a man you've never met is about to say it. You know how she really died, right? A horse? There it is, 5 syllables. One of history's worst lies. A grotesque, vivid, laughably impossible rumour that you, Empress Catherine II of Russia, died during an attempt to have sex with a stallion. Not just immoral, not just insatiable, unhuman. Now let's pump the brakes for a second. You're still very much alive at this point in the story. You're writing, governing and maintaining an iron grip on a volatile empire. But the myth has already started to gallop away, and no one, not your advisors, not your loyal nobles, not even your carefully cultivated image as the enlightened autocrat, is going to rein it in. The story has legs, hooves really, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the source, except, spoiler alert, there isn't one. That's the first red flag. No document, no letter, no diary, no credible account from the time mentions anything close to this rumour during your life. The earliest versions don't even surface until after your death. Which makes it the historical equivalent of someone keying your car after you've already been buried. The most popular version goes like this. Catherine had a custom-built harness designed to lower a horse onto her. The contraption malfunctioned. She was crushed to death. Q-Court scandal, hushed whispers and a state cover-up. Except, none of it happened. Not the horse, not the harness, and definitely not the mechanical engineering feat it would have taken to make such a thing even remotely possible. And yet, people believe it. They want to believe it. Here's your historical fact. Catherine died on November 17th, 1796, of a stroke. That's it. A perfectly ordinary, tragically mundane death. She collapsed in her private bathroom and never regained consciousness. The details were recorded by her attendants. The court went into mourning. Her son Paul took the throne. Life and history moved on. So how does a boring medical event become the filthiest rumour ever attached to a head of state? That's where things get ugly. The truth is, you had enemies. Powerful ones. Many of them were men who hated that you'd ruled alone for over 3 decades. Others were foreign elites jealous of Russia's rise under your leadership. Some were just bitter scholars and court officials who couldn't accept that a woman, especially one not born Russian, had outwitted them all. And when people can't beat you with ideas or armies, they turn to character assassination. It starts with whispers. She takes too many lovers. Then it escalates. She's unnatural. Then it breaks all reason. She died having sex with a horse. It's slander dressed up as tragedy, covered in shock value. And the more it circulates, the more it feeds itself. People repeat it not because it's true, but because it's too outrageous not to. Let's zoom out for a second and look at what this kind of story actually does. The horse rumour doesn't just mock your sexuality, it dehumanises you. It paints you as not just lustful, but animalistic, or not just immoral, but inhuman. It's not about sex, it's about power. It's about fear. Quirky fact of the night, the term hippotogrene, a word meaning like a horse, actually started popping up in fringe writings around the 1800s. Coincidence? Maybe, but it shows how far people were willing to go to invent entire categories of insult just to talk about you. And now let's get to the scholarly debate of the section. Who actually started the rumour? There are 3 leading theories. 1, your son Paul, he hated you, blamed you for sidelining him politically, resented your long reign and liberal reforms. Some think he may have quietly encouraged slander to stain your memory and elevate his own image. 2, the French, specifically the anti-monarchist satirists who loved dragging royals through the muck. They had already turned Marie Antoinette into a scandalous caricature. Why not go for you too? Russia's growing power under your rule threatened their cultural dominance. A horse joke is one way to reclaim the narrative. 3, Victorian moralists. The rumour, while possibly whispered earlier, doesn't show up in writing until the 19th century, when British and French writers start cataloguing the excesses of historical figures. These were people who would blush at a bare ankle and were horrified by your unapologetic rule and your unapologetic sex life. They turned you into a cautionary tale. None of these theories has ironclad proof, but they all make sense, because at the core of the rumour, there's a need. A need to explain why you were powerful, why you didn't collapse under pressure, why men failed to control you. And if they couldn't break you in life, well, they'd do it in death. Meanwhile, you're still ruling like an absolute boss. Even in your 60s, you're pulling all-nighters at your desk, drafting legal codes, responding to European intellectuals, and running a country the size of a continent. You're organising grain storage systems to prevent famines, you're expanding libraries, you're regulating vaccines. Yes, vaccines. In the 1700s. And don't forget the arts. You're commissioning operas, building museums, and turning St. Petersburg into one of Europe's cultural capitals. And what does history remember? The horse. Let's sit with that for a moment. 34 years on the throne, dozens of reforms. A legacy that shaped the Russian Empire for a century. And yet there are people whose entire understanding of you boils down to a slanderous cartoon told over drinks. If it weren't so vile, it would almost be impressive. But here's the thing. The rumour says more about the world than it does about you. It reflects a society that couldn't process a woman's ambition unless it turned her into a monster. A society that had to sexualise and scandalise any woman who stepped outside her expected role. And still, you never apologise, never explain. You rule, you reform, and when the day comes, when the stroke hits and your breath leaves your body, you die as you lived, unbowed. The lie, though, is just getting started. Let's step back into the court for a moment. Not the candlelit chambers and marble corridors of Catherine's reign, but the folk-laced drawing rooms of Europe after her death. The year is 1796. Catherine is gone, dead in her bed, despite the whispers that insist otherwise. Her body lies in state, wrapped in gold-stitched linens, while foreign envoys pay their respects through thinly veiled smirks. And even as the empire mourns, the joke begins to fester. But we're not just talking about a scandal here. We're talking about a full-on campaign of myth-making. Because if you've ever wondered how a woman who ruled a continent became more famous for a rumour than a reign, you're about to find out. First there's Paul, your son, newly crowned Emperor of Russia, clenching the sceptre in one hand and decades of maternal resentment in the other. He'd spent most of his life in your shadow, waiting like a cat outside a locked door for his chance, and now that the door has finally opened, he's ready to redecorate, erase, rewrite. Paul sets to work immediately dismantling your legacy. He reverses your policies, fires your trusted advisors, and cancels your progressive reforms like he's unsubscribing from a newsletter. Some of it is personal, some of it is political, but all of it is driven by the desperate urge to paint you not as a great ruler, but as a cautionary tale. And here's your historical fact. Paul literally buried you differently. In a move equal parts petty and symbolic, he had his father, Peter III, yes, the one you probably had assassinated, exhumed and reburied beside you in the imperial mausoleum. Talk about passive-aggressive family dynamics. It was his way of saying, you may have ruled, mother, but he was the rightful Tsar. It also quietly implied, and maybe you weren't so righteous after all. Paul doesn't last long. He's assassinated in 1801, strangled with a scarf in a plot almost certainly approved by his own son Alexander. And once again, Russia slides into the hands of a new generation. But by now, the damage is done. The Catherine that Europe remembers isn't the Enlightenment Empress, the lawmaker, or the intellectual. She's the caricature, the joke. Let's talk about how this particular rumour spreads, because it's not like someone prints it in a newspaper and suddenly everyone's quoting it. No, this is a slow infection. It starts in whispers among the French elite, morphing into crude satire passed from salon to salon. From there, it drifts into letters, memoirs, and eventually, decades later, into Victorian-era sex manuals and early psychological studies. It's here, in the quiet pages of armchair psychiatry, that the myth finds new oxygen. Enter the 19th century moralists, a group of uptight gentlemen in waistcoats who consider women's ankles risque and faint at the word bosom. They're obsessed with defining what's natural sexuality, which means, of course, identifying everything they deem unnatural. And who better to hold up as Exhibit A than the infamous Russian Empress with a known taste for men and a trail of dead lovers? But a horse? That's not just unnatural, that's bestial. That crosses every line they can draw, and so they draw it again and again. Bigger, more lurid, more dramatic. Quirky fact break. During this same time period, a pamphlet circulated in London titled The lusts of the imperial courtesan, which claimed Catherine had a stable of stallions for her private pleasures. Completely fake, absolutely unhinged, and yet it sold like hotcakes to a public both scandalised and delighted. Erotica disguised as biography. Peak Victorian energy. Back to the damage. Here's what makes this rumour so persistent. It's sticky. It blends the taboo, the absurd, and the misogynistic all in one scandalous cocktail. You've got bestiality, monarchy, death, sex, and power, all tangled together in a story so outrageous, no one bothers to ask if it's even possible. And just for the record, it's not. Let's just take 30 seconds for biology, physics, and common sense. A stallion fully grown weighs over 1,000 pounds. You'd have to engineer a hoisting system with counterweights, restraints, and a team of handlers in 18th century Russia without electricity, and somehow keep it all secret in a palace with hundreds of staff. If that's your plan, you're not Catherine the Great, you're James Bond, but reason isn't the point. The rumour survives because it feels true to the people who already want to believe you're monstrous. That's the genius of a good lie. It flatters the listener's bias. And when that listener already thinks women are too emotional, too sexual, too dangerous to rule, boom, the lie becomes legend. Let's zoom out for a scholarly debate. Is the rumour just about Catherine, or is it part of a broader pattern, where powerful women are sexualised to the point of absurdity, and then publicly destroyed for it? Some historians argue Catherine is a one-off, an outlier, a lightning rod of attention because she ruled so long, so independently, and so successfully. Others say, no, this is exactly what happens to every woman who dares to grab the steering wheel of history. Look at Cleopatra, look at Marie Antoinette, look at Anne Boleyn. If she rises too high, the world drags her back down, not with swords, but with stories. And these stories? They're like ghost pepper seeds. You can bury them for centuries and they'll still sprout in the right conditions. The proof? You're reading this now, 200 years later. The horse rumour hasn't just survived, it's flourished. It's been told in books, whispered in dorm rooms, printed in tabloid rags, and posted on internet forums by people who probably couldn't point to Russia on a map. They don't know your laws, or your cities, or your letters to Voltaire, but they know the horse. So what does that say? About history, about us, and it says that we still all love a scandal more than an achievement. That shame sticks harder than truth. That even the most powerful woman in the world can be reduced to a punchline if the punch is dirty enough. But hey, at least you didn't actually have to ride out on horseback to take down your enemies. You just had to outlive them, which ironically is exactly what the rumour has done to you. By now you've gotten used to ruling through the noise, the speeches, the petitions, the threats, the rumours. None of it ever stops. But power is like riding a storm. You don't wait for silence. You learn to move through the thunder. And even as you're pushing your Enlightenment agenda through layers of stubborn bureaucracy, your court is still buzzing with whispers about your latest favourite. Because yes, you're still choosing lovers, but you're doing it like a CEO hires executives. At this point in your reign, your system is practically formalised. There's a vetting process, a transition period, and sometimes even a little retirement package when the relationship ends. It sounds cold, but it works. You're not exactly looking for soulmates. You're looking for compatibility, loyalty, and someone who isn't dumb enough to confuse your affection for actual political power. That's a rare combination. Let's break it down. When one favourite exits, another enters, often with little ceremony. Sometimes it's a military man. Other times a noble with a decent chin and tolerable conversation skills. Occasionally it's someone you genuinely like. But it's always your decision. No one is pulling your strings. Here's the historical fact for tonight. You had around a dozen official lovers throughout your reign. That's over 3 decades. For comparison, Louis XV of France reportedly kept over 100 mistresses at Versailles alone, most of whom rotated out faster than powdered wigs at a costume party. Yet no one called him unhinged. You, though, one lover every couple of years, and suddenly you're history's most scandalised woman. Let's meet a few of the key players. There's Ivan Rimsky-Korsakov, the court musician turned bedroom baritone. He's handsome, poetic, but not the sharpest sabre in the rack. Eventually he gets caught cheating on you with your best friend. Bold move, you don't scream, you don't cry, you simply dismiss them both, politely, efficiently, like you're clearing your desk before the next state meeting. Then comes Alexander Lanskoy, sweet, youthful, and deeply loyal. He's different, you dote on him, and he genuinely cares for you beyond your title. You shower him with art, with gifts, with affection you don't show anyone else. It's the closest you come to open vulnerability, and when he dies suddenly at just 26, your grief shakes the palace. For once, the gossip takes a step back, because even courtiers know real heartbreak when they see it. But time passes, and so do favourites. After Lanskoy comes Yermolov, then Zubov, each chosen with care, each treated with dignity. You don't discard them like toys, you promote them, pension them, protect them. It's not a harem, it's a carefully curated circle of companionship in a world where trust is rarer than rubies. Still, that doesn't stop the jokes. The court calls them your stallions, your stable, your imperial cavalry, and as the list grows longer, the jabs grow bolder. They don't dare insult you to your face, after all you're still the most powerful person in Russia, but behind closed doors, the caricatures get drawn, the nicknames get whispered, and eventually somewhere in that mess of bad humour and worse intentions, the horse rumour gets a saddle. Because if your desires are already a punchline, why not take the joke further? Enter the French satirists. These men, equal parts clever and cruel, are the Reddit trolls of the Enlightenment. They pride themselves on wit, obscenity, and political subversion. To them, Catherine is an irresistible target, a powerful female monarch with a history of young male lovers and an empire expanding faster than a gossip chain at court. They start publishing pamphlets, mock biographies, with lurid titles, drawing parallels between your military conquests and your alleged carnal ones. One popular satire compares your annexation of Crimea to the seizing of fresh meat, classy. Another portrays your advisors as sex toys with epaulets. Less subtle, quirky fact. Some of these French pamphlets were smuggled into Russia disguised as medical texts or legal treatises. People read them in secret, like contraband literature, giggling behind fans at salons and dinner parties. They weren't just scandalous, they were fun, and fun sticks, even when it's wrong. You know it's happening. You hear the rumours, see the foreign papers, and occasionally catch a courtesan biting their lip to stifle laughter when you walk past. But you don't blink. You never confront it directly. That's the game. You keep ruling while they keep snickering, and somehow that bothers them more than any royal edict ever could. Now for the scholarly debate. Was your rotation of favourites a calculated political strategy, or simply personal indulgence? Some argue it was a form of soft power, a way to build loyalty among the military elite, reward supporters, and maintain a degree of emotional connection in a life that otherwise demanded emotional armour. Others claim it was escapism, that behind the confident exterior was a lonely woman searching for something genuine in a palace full of masks. But maybe it was both. You weren't just a ruler, you were a person. A woman who had spent her youth in a loveless marriage, manoeuvred through betrayal, staged a bloodless coup, and held together a volatile empire. Is it really that strange that you sought comfort in the company of those you trusted? And let's not forget, you didn't lie about it. You weren't sneaking through tunnels or hiding in the shadows. Your lovers were part of the court, public, visible, treated with respect. In a sense, you were living more honestly than the men who mocked you. But truth has never been the most powerful currency in a royal court. So as you cross into your 60s, you find yourself surrounded by courtiers who see you not just as a monarch, but as a myth. They no longer whisper about who's next in your bed, they predict it like a card game. And when there's no new lover on the horizon, they make one up, because the idea of Catherine the Great without scandal? It's unthinkable. You've created a legacy, but the world's already working on a second draft. You're reclining in your gilded study, a stack of correspondence at your elbow and a silver tray of preserved fruits untouched beside you. Outside, St. Petersburg crackles under a dull winter sun, the Neva River frozen into a mirror of pale blue glass. Snow coats the city like powdered sugar, but inside the air is warm with fire and the rustle of paper. You're in your early 60s now, but age wears differently on an empress. You're not shrinking, you're sharpening, settling, becoming more dangerous in the way a mountain becomes dangerous when people forget it can still erupt. Tonight, you're thinking about Grigory Orlov. It's been years since he was your favourite, but his shadow still clings to the walls. He wasn't your first lover, but he was the one who changed everything. A brute with surprising moments of tenderness. A man who helped you take the throne and expected, wrongly, that this meant something eternal. He gave you power when you needed it, then expected a throne at your side, and when he didn't get it, he started to crumble, little by little, like stone worn down by disappointment. Grigory Orlov was not subtle. He didn't whisper in corridors or play games with lace fans and knowing glances. He swung through court like a wrecking ball, charming, bold, violent when necessary. And in 1762, when you pulled off the coup that toppled your husband, it was Orlov who rallied the troops, who stormed the barracks, who stood beside you in your carriage as the crowd roared your name. Without him, you may not have ascended. With him, though, you couldn't stay balanced for long. Your historical fact: Grigory Orlov led the Imperial Guard during the coup that made you Empress. It was an unprecedented moment, a woman seizing power with the full support of the military. And not just any military, one made up of swaggering officers, hardened by war, loyal to tradition. Orlov turned them into believers. Not of you as a woman, of you as a ruler. And yes, the sex helped. Let's not pretend it didn't. You were lovers. You were conspicuous about it too, allowing him in your private chambers, placing him in positions of influence. But it wasn't just lust. It was strategy. Love and power tangled like vines. After the coup, you rewarded him handsomely. You gave him titles, estates, and public gratitude. You even offered marriage, briefly, or at least that's what he believed. But deep down, you knew it couldn't last. Grigory was brave, but he wasn't brilliant. His temper frightened the court. His mouth ran faster than his mind. And eventually, you outgrew him. When he proposed again, years later, you refused. Gently, but firmly. That's when things got dark. Orlov began to spiral. He gambled, drank. His mind grew unstable, troubled, paranoid. There were whispers of madness, of hallucinations. One report claims he roamed the palace talking to portraits. Another that he thought his dog was giving him military orders. Whether it was grief, syphilis, or something else entirely, you'll never know. But eventually you sent him away, not in punishment, in mercy. Here's a quirky fact for tonight. Grigory once gifted you a diamond as large as a pigeon's egg. It was named simply the Orlov, and it now sits in the imperial scepter, still part of the Russian crown jewels. That's how complicated your relationships were. You could exile a man and still carry his legacy in your hand. Back at court, the gossip machine ate it up. The mad lover, the discarded general, the wild man of the Empress's bed. They told tales of him howling at the moon from his estate, clutching letters you never sent. Some claimed he tried to return to you in disguise. Others said he was locked in a padded room lined with mirrors so he could only talk to himself. Fiction mostly, but fiction is stickier than truth. Now let's shift to the most famous what-if in your love life. Prince Grigory Potemkin. Ah, Potemkin. Not a wrecking ball, a chess player. A hurricane with a law degree. You meet him not long after Orlov fades into the background. He's an officer, a courtier, and soon, your equal. You don't just fall for him, you recognize him. He's like you, ambitious, charming, intellectually voracious, and totally unafraid. And unlike Orlov, Potemkin knows how to handle you without trying to control you. Your connection with him runs deeper than the usual palace infatuation. He becomes your advisor, your co-ruler in all but name. You trust him with armies, foreign policy, and your heart. And here's the historical debate. Did you marry him in secret? There are rumours, strong ones, that you did. That there was a quiet ceremony, witnessed only by a priest and a few confidants. No fanfare, no public declaration, just a private promise. If it's true, it would have made him your husband in the eyes of God, but not the state. Scholars still argue about it. Some believe you needed to preserve the image of an unmarried empress to keep your throne stable. Others think you simply preferred the freedom. Whatever the truth, your bond with Potemkin lasts for decades, even after the romantic part ends. You go on to have other favourites, but none ever displace him. You sign letters to him with yours forever, and he signs back with devoted as ever. When he dies in 1791, you write that the world is darker without him. You do not attend his funeral, you stay at your desk, working. The Empress does not mourn in public. Quirky detail, Potemkin was a fashion icon. His capes alone could fund a small town. He had a flair for theatrics and once hosted a feast in a tent city filled with fake villages, an extravagant show for visiting dignitaries that gave birth to the term Potemkin village, meaning something impressive on the surface, hollow underneath. Ironically, Potemkin himself was the opposite. As you get older, the men get younger. Not because you're desperate, because you're powerful. Because the older men at court are too scared of you and the younger ones are eager to please. You don't need romance. You need loyalty, affection, and someone who knows their place. It's not exactly love, but it's peace, and for you that's rare. But each new favourite becomes another brushstroke in the myth you never asked for. She changed lovers like gloves. She only wanted boys. She devoured them. And so Grigory Orlov becomes the savage brute you tamed. Potemkin, the lover-husband you couldn't admit. And all the rest? Just bodies on a rotating stage. At least that's the version people whisper over wine. Because no one wants to talk about the part where you stayed up 3 nights in a row rewriting agricultural tax law. Or the days you spent drafting letters to starving provinces. Or the speech you gave to the army after Potemkin's death that made soldiers cry. No. They want the version with the jewels, the bedchambers, and the rotating cast of lovers. They want a woman too powerful, too sexual, too much, and eventually the truth can't compete. You wake to the sound of hooves in the courtyard. Always hooves. Couriers arriving at dawn, guards changing shifts, carriages bringing nobles who pretend their visits are about diplomacy and not curiosity. Because more than ever, you are a fascination. Not just a ruler, not just a woman, but a spectacle. Catherine the Great, empress, stateswoman, and, if the rumours are to be believed, some kind of feral temptress who snacks on soldiers and probably keeps a whip under her pillow. You sit by the fire, spooning cherries into your tea, and the room is silent save for the crackle of burning birch. You're in your 60s, past the point where most monarchs have either died or handed things off to heirs who are far less competent. But you're still running an empire, still writing, still reading letters from Voltaire, still planning new schools, new laws, new cities. But what's the gossip in St. Petersburg this week? That you've taken another lover, and that he's so young, he barely shaves. Enter Platon Zubov, the last and most controversial of your favourites. He's 22 when you meet. You're 60. The court practically breaks its collective jaw from the force of its own gasps. The age gap becomes its own subplot, as if this is a fairy tale gone sideways. But he's charming, gentle, eager to please, and most importantly, malleable. He doesn't challenge you like Potemkin did, or brood like Orlov. He fits the role of companion without the dangerous delusion that he's your equal. Historical fact: Zubov rose rapidly through the ranks during your final years. You showered him with estates, titles, influence. He even became the Governor-General of New Russia, the same region Potemkin had once helped conquer. To some, this looked like favoritism gone mad. To others, it was simply a ruler rewarding loyalty in the only way she could. Either way, it was a scandal waiting to be decorated with horns and hooves. The age difference made Zubov an easy target. Satirists drew you like a predatory spider, trapping young men in her web. One cartoon from the time showed you reclining in bed while a line of soldiers stretched out the door, each holding a number, like a butcher shop of lust. Subtlety was not in style, and somehow, amid all these caricatures, the horse rumour begins to mutate. Because now it's not just about you being scandalous, it's about you being insatiable, unnatural, no longer content with men regardless of their youth or charm. The slanderous logic goes, if she can have anyone and she keeps wanting more, what stops her? The answer, for your enemies, becomes grotesque. They invent a limit you must have crossed, and the image they land on is so absurd, so outrageous, that it outlives every document you ever signed. Quirky fact of the night. In one of the more bizarre historical artifacts, an anonymous erotic novel from the early 1800s titled Memoirs of an Imperial Courtesan describes a Queen of the North who designs a mechanical apparatus to bring about her own extinction by ecstasy. It doesn't name you, but come on, it's not subtle. The book was banned, copied, passed around like forbidden candy. And guess what rumour it helped spread? Yep, the one with the horse. Meanwhile, you're busy doing things like founding a medical college for women. You're writing about the rights of peasants. You're managing a multi-front diplomatic dance between Prussia, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. But every time someone doesn't like a decision you make, they don't argue policy, they make jokes about stables. And here's where the scholarly debate gets interesting. Some argue the horse rumour wasn't originally about you at all, that it came from an older European folktale, passed down orally, about a nameless noblewoman who died in an unspeakable way. Over time, they say, the story was retrofitted to your life because you were powerful enough, foreign enough, and female enough to wear it well. Others argue it had to be about you because it was too specific, too cruel, and too deliberate. Either way, by the mid-1800s, your name and that story are tangled together in dozens of books, papers, and private letters. It has become horrifyingly part of your biography. Let's go deeper. Why a horse? Because throughout history, horses have symbolized freedom, power, virility. All things that by your critics' standards you were never supposed to possess. You were meant to be tamed, not the one holding the reins. And so they flip the metaphor. If you won't submit to a man, they claim you'll submit to a beast. If you insist on mastery, they turn it into madness. It's a literary hit job disguised as dirty folklore. It's worth noting that your love of horses was real, but never romantic. You kept a stable, you rode often, you had a favourite mare named Brillante, known for her silver-white coat and uncanny calmness. There's a story that you once rode Brillante through a storm without flinching, while others cowered indoors. To you, horses were symbols of grace and control. Never excess, never that. And yet, here we are. Your body isn't even cold yet, and already this filth is being passed around like a secret handshake among the morally righteous and the gleefully depraved. The story gives your enemies everything they want, proof of your depravity, a reason to dismiss your accomplishments, and a cautionary tale wrapped in absurdity. But here's the cruel irony. The more ridiculous the rumour became, the more it stuck. Because people remember a wild story, they don't need facts, they need images. And what's more unforgettable than an empress and a horse? It doesn't matter that you died of a stroke. It doesn't matter that your autopsy disproved every part of the tale. That's not what they talk about over brandy. Even today, in classrooms, in lazy documentaries, in the darker corners of the internet, people repeat it, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with venom. But almost never with curiosity. They don't ask why the story started, or what it says about the people who needed to invent it. And you're not here to defend yourself. But if you were, you'd probably raise an eyebrow, pour a glass of wine, and remind them that while they were talking about horses, you were building an empire. So now, let's talk about it directly. The horse. Or more accurately, the horse, capital H. Because up until now, it's been skirting around the edges, sneaking in through satire, slithering beneath the robes of scandal, but never quite galloping fully into the room. Tonight it arrives. Not because it's real, not because it was ever even remotely possible, but because the story itself has become part of your legacy, and we can't pretend it didn't leave hoofprints on your history. Let's start with what the rumour actually says. You, Catherine the Great, Empress, Conqueror, Philosopher Queen, died attempting to have sexual intercourse with a horse, or supposedly you had a mechanical harness constructed to suspend the animal above you. The system malfunctioned, the horse collapsed, crushed you, and killed you. And naturally, this was all hushed up by your attendants, who found your body in a state so indecent it had to be buried under a fabricated story about a stroke. It's grotesque, it's absurd, and yet it has lived for over 2 centuries. There's no source, no witness, no documentation, not even a poorly written diary entry from some minor court official who saw the body. The earliest mentions of this supposed incident come decades after your death, often in satirical books or whispered anecdotes passed around in gentlemen's clubs where powdered wigs had given way to pipe smoke and Victorian smugness. Your actual death was mundane by royal standards. On November 17th, 1776, you suffered a stroke in your private bathroom. You were found quickly, placed in bed, and lingered unconscious for several hours before passing. Doctors confirmed the cause: cerebral hemorrhage. There was no scandal, no mechanical devices, no animals in the room unless you count your Pomeranian, which, frankly, is as close as this story gets to factual. So why? Of all possible rumours, this one. Because the horse rumour isn't about an event. It's about annihilation. The final, definitive character assassination. It turns you not just into a punchline, but a beast. A grotesque distortion of everything you represented. Power, autonomy, femininity on your own terms. This story isn't content to mock your sexuality, it has to destroy it, to destroy you. And this is where things get interesting. Let's dig into the psychological mechanics of the rumour. First, consider the basic structure. A woman seeks so much pleasure that no man can satisfy her. She turns then to an animal. It's a tale of escalation, of excess, of too much. That's the real crime in this story. Not bestiality, but ambition. The idea that a woman could want more, need more, be more than her society was willing to accept. In that way, the rumour is an ideological weapon. It punishes you posthumously for daring to live outside the mould. You weren't just a ruler, you were a woman who made choices, who took lovers, who didn't apologise, and that, to certain people, was a crime worse than treason. Here's your historical fact for this section. The first written mention of the horse rumour doesn't appear until the mid-1800s in a privately published collection of court anecdotes. The author cites no sources and includes it alongside other obviously fabricated tales, including one about a French duke who supposedly died of oversatisfaction. It was essentially 19th century clickbait. But by the time the Victorian era gets fully underway, the story becomes a kind of folk history. People repeat it without question because it scratches an itch. It makes them feel morally superior. It reinforces their worldview. Powerful women are dangerous, and if they fall, it must be because of their appetites, not their enemies. There's a quirky and chilling parallel here to another famous rumour, the death of Pope John XII, who was said to have died during sex. Or the myth that Caligula appointed his horse a consul, blurring lines between animal and state. Humans, it turns out, have a long tradition of folding animals into the downfall of those they despise. Why? Because it humiliates. It creates distance between subject and sympathy. You don't pity a monster, you mock it. So here's the scholarly debate. Did the horse rumour originate as a political smear? Or was it always a perverse joke told for the laughs? Was it born in the salons of your enemies, crafted to poison your legacy like arsenic in a glass of wine? Or was it simply a lowbrow tale that caught fire because people love the grotesque? There's evidence for both. What's certain is this: the story served its purpose. It rewrote you, not in stone, but in whispers, in half-remembered facts and scandalous giggles. It turned your real death into an opportunity to erase everything else, your reforms, your writings, your contributions to law and education, and replace it with a single image. One that can't be unseen. The most perverse part? It worked. Even now, in the age of search engines and scholarly articles, the horse rumour still comes up first when your name is mentioned in certain circles. People believe it, or want to. It's made its way into novels, TV shows, stand-up routines, and late-night trivia games. They call it Catherine the Great's dirty secret, as if the real secret isn't that the story is complete fabrication. But here's what they miss. You didn't die because of a horse, you died having ruled longer than any woman in Russian history. You died after expanding your empire by hundreds of thousands of square miles, after founding hospitals, schools and universities, after writing plays, political treatises and memoirs, after surviving palace coups, heartbreaks, and more than a few disasters that would have sunk lesser rulers. You died a queen, and the only tragedy is that the world still can't say that without also mumbling something about a horse. So yes, let's talk about it. Let's face it directly. Let's pull this story into the light and examine it for what it is. A lie so ridiculous it's only believable because people want it to be. Not because of you, but because of what you threaten. Because you were too much. Too smart, too confident, too curious, too alive. And the world in its smallness couldn't take that. So it handed you a myth and called it history. But you know better. And now, so do we. The hooves are still echoing louder now. Not from stables, but from the dusty corners of forgotten bookshelves and search engines, dragging that horse along behind your name like a tin can tied to the back of a wedding carriage. You've been dead for decades, but somehow you're more alive in gossip than you ever were in textbooks. Because here's the dirty truth. No matter how many volumes are written about your political reforms, legal codes, or cultural patronage, there's always someone at the back of the room whispering, yeah, but didn't she, you know. So we have to ask, why horses? Why that? Why not something more plausible? Why not a scandal involving, say, a hidden affair with a foreign prince or a love child locked away in a convent? Something at least tethered to the realm of possibility. But no, your detractors leapt straight to bestiality. Full speed, no brakes. This tells us something, and not just about the people who created the story. It tells us about what terrified them most. A woman with power who appeared to enjoy it. Let's remember, the 18th century wasn't exactly teeming with female rulers, and those who did reign were often forced to perform a delicate pantomime of royal femininity, chaste, maternal, deferential to the real power behind the throne, which, spoiler alert, was always supposed to be male. But not you. You took the throne and never pretended it belonged to anyone else. You didn't lean on a husband or let your son run the show. You governed, you reformed, you even wrote, like actual political theory, not just floral letters and romantic poems. Historical fact, Catherine penned over a dozen political essays and charters, including her famed Nakaz, a document of liberal legal principles meant to guide the revision of Russian law. It was inspired by Montesquieu and Beccaria, filled with Enlightenment ideals about criminal justice, equality, and the limitations of power. It circulated widely throughout Europe, admired by philosophers, quoted by statesmen, but of course, none of those Enlightenment guys ever got rumours spread that they died under a barn animal. Because here's what you did that they didn't. You were female, and unapologetically so. You enjoyed romance, you didn't hide your lovers, you flirted, you decorated your apartments in your own taste. You filled your court with music, laughter, young energy. You were powerful, and you appeared to be enjoying it. And that was too much for the world to process, so they gave you a punishment shaped like a punchline. Now, let's take a little detour through the land of Freud. Yes, Sigmund himself, because if there's any modern lens through which people try to make sense of the horse rumour, it's psychoanalysis. Freud, bless his cigar-chomping heart, would have likely seen this as a textbook case of what he called the Madonna whore complex. That is, when society can't handle the idea of a woman who is both respected and sexual, so it splits her into two incompatible halves, the sacred and the profane. You, obviously, got cast as the profane, over and over. The jokes about your lovers weren't just meant to mock, they were meant to debase, to undo your authority by reducing it to something primal and grotesque. As if a woman who enjoyed sex couldn't possibly govern well. As if appetite and intellect are mutually exclusive. It's laughable, except that no one's laughing anymore, because the damage stuck. And here's your quirky fact of the evening. There was a real-life incident involving a woman and a horse that did contribute to the law, just not in the way people think. In 1790, an anonymous French pamphlet circulated claiming to be a memoir of a noblewoman who had been ruined by her obsession with stallions. It wasn't about you, but the overlap was enough for some readers to draw a line, especially when these pamphlets were republished with your name pasted over the original. That's how rumours work in a pre-internet world. Slow and sticky, they seep into letters, into satirical engravings, into pulp fiction and tavern talk. And once your name is attached to something that vile, it doesn't matter how untrue it is, it becomes part of the character you never agreed to play. This brings us to the scholarly debate. Is this just old-fashioned misogyny, or something darker? Some historians argue the rumour is a classic case of gendered slander, the same cocktail of fear and fascination that's haunted powerful women since Cleopatra. That it's all about control, making the ambitious woman ridiculous, so people don't have to take her seriously. Others argue the story reflects a deeper cultural anxiety about female autonomy and the breakdown of traditional power structures. You weren't just challenging men, you were challenging the order itself. Kings took mistresses, queens were supposed to take tea. And then there's a more modern school of thought, which suggests the rumour survives because it's so transgressive, so shocking, that it pushes into the realm of taboo folklore. Like urban legends about celebrities in compromising positions, it becomes a kind of cultural venting system. People repeat it not because they believe it, but because it thrills them to say it aloud. Still, even among all this analysis, there's something oddly personal about the persistence of the lie. It's not just history that betrayed you, it's culture. The very same culture that celebrated your taste in art, your love of literature, your patronage of Enlightenment thinkers. They put your name next to Voltaire in one breath, and next to a stable in the next, or... Let's take a moment to imagine an alternate version of you. A version that history could have remembered without the stain of that rumour. She'd be Catherine the Reformer, Catherine the Enlightened, Catherine the Empire Builder. She'd be quoted in political science classes, cited in women's studies textbooks as a pioneer. She'd be listed alongside Elizabeth of Fürth and Victoria, not just as a monarch, but as a mind. And yet here we are, still clearing manure off your reputation 2 centuries later. It's not fair, it's not right, but it's the reality of how history works when it gets filtered through power, shame, and a society that can't stop laughing at its own cruelty. But maybe that's changing. Maybe we're finally beginning to peel the lie away and ask the harder question. Not did she, but why did anyone want us to think she did? And when we answer that, maybe we'll find a way back to the truth. You're everywhere now, not just in textbooks or dusty portraits, but on screen, on stage, in books with glittery covers and streaming shows with actors who are far too young and far too cheekbone to look anything like you actually did. They dress you in silk and scandal, cast you in candlelight, and drop every line like it's dipped in perfume and innuendo. You've become a character, a trope, and somewhere in the background the horse rumour lingers like a bad cologne, faint, pungent, impossible to fully scrub out. But let's roll back the curtain on one of the main culprits in this mess. Art. Not art as in Da Vinci and Rembrandt, but the art that blurs lines. The suggestive paintings, the erotic engravings, the suggestively titled anonymous publications that filled Europe's black markets and backrooms like mushrooms after rain. Because while it was easy enough for your political enemies to whisper scandal, it was pictures, lurid, satirical, sometimes outright pornographic, that really sold the lie. Let's start with the portraits. During your reign, you commissioned dozens, maybe hundreds, of official images. Most show you regal and composed, in military dress or flowing robes, eyes stern, posture flawless. But even those got twisted. After your death, artists started reimagining you, placing you in eroticized poses, surrounded by Roman gods and heavily suggestive symbolism. There's a late 19th century engraving, for example, that shows you lounging in a bed shaped like a saddle, with a horse statue at the foot of it. It's not labelled Catherine outright, but it doesn't have to be. The implication is practically screaming. And then, of course, there's the erotica. Your historical fact, between 1820 and 1900, over a dozen pornographic books were published in France and England that either directly referenced you or used a thinly veiled version of your name. Titles like Memoirs of a Northern Queen or The Stallion of the Steppes promised to reveal the secret pleasures of Catherine the Great, usually featuring stories written by men who had never opened a history book in their lives but had definitely been kicked out of several taverns. These weren't just obscure leaflets. Some of them went through multiple printings, pirated copies appearing as far afield as India and New York. Illustrations inside depicted scenes of excess, banquets turning into orgies, soldiers stripping off their uniforms at your command, and yes, more than one image involving horses in suggestive proximity. These books were the 19th century equivalent of tabloid smut, and they sold well. Quirky fact: one British bookseller was famously arrested in 1891 for displaying a cover illustration of you being attended by centaurs. Yes, centaurs. Apparently a half-man, half-horse was just the right mix of plausible fantasy and risque metaphor. The court case caused a minor scandal in London, with moralists clutching their pearls and readers discreetly trying to get their hands on a copy before the whole shipment got confiscated. But these weren't harmless jokes. They were cultural grenades, dressed up as titillation. Because each time a new pamphlet dropped, it reinforced the same idea that your sexuality defined your legacy, that your intellect, your political savvy, your vision, those were incidental. The real story, the one people wanted, was between the sheets, or under the hooves. And here's where the translation issue comes into play. Let's talk about mistranslations, those fun little twists of language that mutate facts into fiction. French, especially in the 18th century, was loaded with double meanings and euphemisms. When Enlightenment thinkers wrote about you as the empress with imperial appetites, or the rider of men, they may have meant it metaphorically. But when those phrases got translated into English or German, they lost their clever edge and came off, well, literal. One infamous example is a passage in a satirical letter where you're described as domptant les bêtes comme les hommes, which literally means taming beasts as well as men, meant metaphorically, but it was translated in some circles as mounting beasts as she did men. See the difference? One is a political metaphor, the other is basically an accusation. This, compounded with your reputation for equestrianism, your love of riding, your frequent appearances on horseback, your commissioning of equestrian statues, added fuel to the stable fire. You weren't just good at horseback riding, you were always seen riding. That alone made the lie easier to build. Because when a story is visual, it doesn't need facts, just a few suggestive details strung together in the right order. And of course there's the recurring joke that artists always gave your horses big eyes, as if the animals themselves were scandalized by the gossip. But let's not pretend the myth spread only because people misunderstood your riding habits or a few translations went awry. This was willful, it was malicious, it was meant to humiliate. Because again, it all comes back to control. You see, monarchs have always been judged on their tastes, what they wore, what they ate, who they slept with. But women rulers, they get dissected. Their private lives become public property, their emotions become weaknesses, their bodies become weapons used against them. Here's the scholarly debate of the section. Was this smear campaign truly exceptional, or just part of a long tradition of character assassination against powerful women? Historians are split. Some say yes, you were uniquely targeted because of your unprecedented power and unapologetic behaviour, that no other female monarch endured this level of grotesque rumour-mongering. Others argue you were part of a much older cycle. From Lucretia to Cleopatra to Anne Boleyn, history is lined with women whose stories ended with either tragic death or public disgrace, often helped along by rumours too delicious to fact-check. But the real question is, would the same story have worked if it were about a man? Imagine it, as a rumoured to have died in bed with a cow, or an emperor said to have had a mechanical device to allow birds to serenade him into ecstasy. It'd be laughed off, ridiculous. No one would take it seriously. It wouldn't stick. But with you, it sticks, because it was never really about horses. It was about bringing you down. Yet despite all of this, the rumours, the satire, the literal pornographic reinterpretations, you endured. Your reign outlived your critics. Your empire grew. And your legacy is still here, still debated, still reshaping how we think about power, gender, and the stories we choose to tell. Even if we have to dig through some manure to get there. Let's change the scene, step away from the salons and the stables and into the candlelit minds of the Enlightenment philosophers, the highbrow thinkers whose powdered wigs housed some of the most powerful ideas of the 18th century. Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Montesquieu, these were the heavy hitters, the intellectual gods of their time. And to their great credit or occasional confusion, they adored you. Yes, adored, not always consistently, not always respectfully, but you were, without question, the empress they all wanted to believe in. You, Catherine II, the only monarch with enough nerve to write letters to Voltaire and call him out playfully when he got things wrong, the woman who sent money to support Diderot when his finances collapsed, who ordered copies of banned Enlightenment texts and had them translated into Russian, printed, and circulated like revolutionary candy. Your historical fact: you corresponded with Voltaire for over 15 years. He called you the Star of the North. You called him my philosopher. The letters, nearly 200 of them, discussed politics, censorship, reform, and occasionally snarky jokes about your mutual enemies. He never visited Russia, but he fantasized about it constantly, imagining your court as a rational paradise lit by reason and French wine. But here's the twist. These men, these Enlightenment titans, also couldn't quite escape their own blind spots, because while they loved your mind, your ambition, your wit, they also exoticized you. They turned you into a symbol, not a woman, but an idea, a paradox. A sexy empress with the mind of a philosopher and the power of a god. They didn't quite know what to do with you. Diderot, for example, visited your court and was dazzled, overwhelmed. You offered him a salary and full access to your library. He reportedly spilled wine on himself during one of your meetings. He admired your legal reforms, your ideas about education, your rejection of religious extremism, but even he occasionally slipped into writing about you as if you were some mythical creature. Half Pallas Athena, half Circe. Voltaire, more cynical, was sometimes accused by his critics of using you to advance his own status. After all praising a powerful monarch for being enlightened made him look clever too. Some of his letters praise your intellect so feverishly that they begin to sound less like political admiration and more like low-key fan fiction. And yet, when your reputation started to take a turn, when the rumours about your lovers spread across Europe, did they defend you? Sort of. But not always, not enough. Here's the problem. For all their talk of rationalism and human dignity, these Enlightenment bros were still men of their time. And their time didn't quite know how to handle a woman with power who also enjoyed men. They wanted queens to be intellectual ornaments, not actual rulers. They admired your brain but felt weird about your body. Cue the passive-aggressive compliments. In one letter, Voltaire praises your masculine intellect, as though femininity couldn't possibly house brilliance. Diderot, while defending you publicly, described your romantic history as a symptom of unchecked vitality. Rousseau, who, to be fair, barely liked any woman who didn't fit into his extremely narrow view of female virtue, ignored you almost entirely, as if you were an inconvenient exception to his theories about women needing to remain domestic and pure. So what happens when a brilliant woman doesn't conform to the philosophical ideal of female virtue? She becomes a cautionary tale, and that tale begins to curdle. Quirky fact. Diderot once gifted you a sculpture of a nude female figure meant to represent wisdom. It was supposed to be tasteful, intellectual. You reportedly found it awkward, and had it moved to a less public spot in the palace. That about sums up the relationship, mutual admiration tinged with cultural whiplash. But here's where things really turn. As the 18th century rolled into the 19th, the Enlightenment gave way to romanticism, and suddenly reason was out. Emotion was in. The myth of the rational empress was no longer fashionable. What people wanted now was scandal, passion, ruin. Enter the flood of semi-fictional memoirs, erotic novels, and those delightful scandal histories sold under the counter in Paris and London. You stopped being Catherine the lawgiver. You became Catherine the lustful. Here's where the horse rumour picks up steam, wrapped in the language of pseudo-philosophy. One satirical essay, written under a pen name but widely read in Paris, argued that your alleged animalistic appetites were the inevitable result of a woman exposed to too much unchecked power. That absolute rule, combined with physical desire, would always lead to perversion. It's almost funny, if it weren't so insulting. These were the same people who had praised Louis XIV for having mistresses in every wing of Versailles, who swooned over stories of Hun emperors and their male harems. But you took lovers and read Voltaire, so clearly you were deranged. Here's the scholarly debate. Were the Enlightenment thinkers complicit in your later vilification? Did they create the public persona that eventually became easy to defile? Or were they genuinely supportive, their admiration twisted later by the lesser minds? Some argue Voltaire and Diderot tried their best, especially within the constraints of their era, that their admiration was real, if occasionally paternalistic. Others argue they fed the fire by mythologizing you in the first place, making it easier for future generations to turn you into either a goddess or a grotesque. But here's what no one debates. They never really saw you as just a person, a woman with ambition, flaws, talents, and desires. You were always a symbol, either of hope or ruin, and that made it easier for others, later, hungrier for scandal, to twist the image however they liked. So when the horse story began creeping through the lower levels of Europe's gossip pipelines, it wasn't just a lie. It was the logical endpoint of years of uncomfortable admiration. A twisted little capstone on an edifice built by people who could handle your mind, but not your body. Who could quote your essays, but couldn't deal with the fact that you were unashamed of pleasure. You were supposed to be enlightened, but only in the mind. And when you insisted on living in your body too, well, then came the saddle jokes. There's something almost poetic, if we're being generous, about how power in a woman is always met with animal metaphors. Not metaphors of grace or cleverness, mind you. No one calls the queen a dolphin or a fox. No, they reach straight for the jugular. Beasts of appetite, creatures that need taming, the lioness, the tigress, the serpent, the sow, or in your case, Catherine the Great, the mare. And while we're here, let's look around. Because you're not the only one they did this to. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, famously accused of orgies, incest, and bathing in the blood of virgins. Elizabeth I. The Virgin Queen was either chaste to the point of inhumanity, or secretly sleeping with every man who crossed her path, depending on which whisper you caught. Cleopatra, half goddess, half seductress, allegedly so magnetic she could bend the will of Rome itself, not with politics, mind you, but with eyeliner and snake-like sexuality. This is a pattern, not a coincidence. The historical fact. Royal women have always been portrayed in beastly or dehumanized terms when they wield power beyond their expected capacity. As far back as ancient Mesopotamia, goddesses of war and rule were linked to lions, bulls, or dragons, symbolic, sure, but never subtle. By the Enlightenment era, these metaphors were no longer flattering, they were grotesque. They reduced female power to hunger, not just for control or justice, but for flesh. In this world, a queen can't just rule, she devours, she seduces, she emasculates. And when her enemies can't unseat her politically, they dehumanize her. It's a little like putting an empress in a zoo exhibit. Caution, may bite. Approach with gossip. And that's how the beast becomes the story. By the time the Catherine the Horse rumour really takes root in the 19th century, it's not just a wild tale anymore, it's a literary motif. A grotesque extension of a long-standing cultural formula. Powerful woman plus sexuality at monstrosity. Simple math, really. The kind even the most underqualified of your enemies could understand. Let's pause for a quirky fact. In 1852, a popular London stage play titled The Empress Unbridled premiered in a tiny backstreet theatre. It was a satirical slapstick comedy. Think bawdy innuendos, wigs falling off, actors tripping over props. and its Catherine character was essentially a walking double entendre. She chased soldiers around the stage, flirted with stable boys, and was eventually crushed under a suspiciously lifelike puppet horse that dropped from the rafters during the final act. The crowd howled. Critics called it vulgar but hilarious. Tickets sold out for weeks. That's the part that stings most. It wasn't just elites or academics who helped this myth take root. It was everyone. The public loved it, ate it up, because somewhere along the way the story stopped being about you and started being about them. Their fears, their fantasies, their need to see a woman who dared to reach for too much brought low, not by armies, but by her own supposed appetite. Which brings us to the scholarly debate of the night. Are these animal metaphors about punishment or permission? In other words, when society paints a woman as a beast, are they doing it to condemn her or to make her appetites feel exciting in a way that still keeps her safely other? Is the monstrous queen a cautionary tale or a guilty pleasure? Some say it's clearly about punishment, that the grotesque stories function like social warnings. Don't be like her. Stay in your lane, know your place. Others argue it's more complicated, that the same rumour that degrades also seduces, that the reason the Catherine story sticks is because it gives people an excuse to be titillated under the guise of moral outrage. There's a name for this kind of cultural double standard, the virgin whore paradox, but in your case, it's worse. You weren't even allowed to exist in that binary, you were something else entirely. The woman who ruled without hiding it, the woman who loved without apologising. So the rumour invents a third category, not virgin, not whore, beast. Because here's the thing, calling you a slut wouldn't have been enough. That's ordinary, too human. And your legacy, it wasn't human-sized. It was imperial, colossal, inconvenient. So they reached for something bigger, darker, stupider. A rumour that had to be false but felt true to people who already believed your ambition was unnatural. And once the rumour found a body, yours, it grew teeth. And people love stories with teeth. They love the rhythm of the rise and the fall. They love watching the powerful stumble, especially when the fall comes not from war or assassination, but from something shameful. They want you to trip over your own desires, to fall not as a ruler, but as a woman who flew too close to the sun, not with wings, but with thighs. The tragedy. You saw this all coming. You once wrote in a letter to Friedrich Melchior Grimm, "My enemies will say anything, and those who envy me will believe it." You weren't wrong, you knew exactly what would happen. You even joked about it. Told Grimm that if history failed to praise your reforms, perhaps they will praise my lovers instead. You just didn't know they'd trade your lovers for livestock. So what's left of the woman behind the myth? The real Catherine? She's still there. Still writing letters, drafting policy, reading Voltaire in bed, still wearing velvet at 65, and hosting dinner parties with so much laughter that even your political rivals sometimes forgot to be afraid of you. Still commissioning art, building libraries, negotiating borders, and expanding the empire farther than any Romanov before or after. But the public, they aren't always looking for a nuanced ruler. They want a headline. And what's the headline? Empress dies in steel. Never mind the truth. Never mind the revolution of thought and policy you left behind. Never mind that your own son, who you protected, promoted, and watched with maternal caution, would dismantle much of what you built the moment your pulse stopped. Because the lie gallops faster than the truth, and that beast, it's not the horse, it's the rumour, and it's still running. Let's drift a little west, shall we? Across the cold stretch of Europe, past Prussia and over the Rhine, until you find yourself in the smoky, glittering salons of 18th century France, a country obsessed with wine, lace, revolution, and above all, satire. If Russia was where you ruled, then France was where your image was hijacked, dressed up, stripped down, and paraded across paper like a circus act. And if we're going to follow the trail of the horse rumour to its earliest, most ridiculous roots, then we have to admit something that might hurt your Russian soul just a bit. A lot of it was France's fault. France, for all its Enlightenment brilliance, had a deeply complicated relationship with women in power, especially women who weren't French. They could admire you from afar, but admiration always came dipped in a thick sauce of mockery. You were too clever, too assertive, too sexually autonomous. To the French literary class, you weren't a ruler. You were a punchline waiting to be turned into a bawdy rhyme. Here's your historical fact. Satirical prints about you were circulating in France long before your death. The first wave came in the 1770s, portraying you as a wanton empress surrounded by muscular guards and suggestively placed sceptres. The imagery wasn't subtle. One particularly infamous engraving depicted La Tsarine Libertine, seated on a throne shaped like a man's lower half. You can imagine the rest. These prints didn't come from Russia. They weren't based on eyewitness accounts. Most were drawn by artists who had never stepped foot outside of Paris. They based their sketches on rumours, caricatures, and the collective fantasy of what a powerful woman must be doing in the privacy of her royal chambers. You were, to them, a concept more than a person, a ripe target for satire at a time when mocking monarchs was both fashionable and increasingly political. Quirky fact: one of the best-selling underground pamphlets of 1784 was La Vérité nue de la Tsarine, or The Naked Truth of the Tsarina. It claimed to be a memoir written by a dismissed maid of yours, full of confessions about your stable of lovers, beasts, and lubricious inventions. It was entirely fake. But that didn't stop it from being translated into 3 languages and sold in brothels, cafes, and revolutionary clubs alike. No one believed it. Not really. But belief wasn't the point. The point was to spread the image. And that image? It was increasingly 4-legged. Because French satire didn't stop at mocking your lovers. It turned to animals, to horses specifically. Horses, after all, were already your symbol. Your public portraits often showed you on horseback. You had a statue of Peter the Great commissioned, on a rearing steed no less. You rode during military reviews, during ceremonies, even casually through your estates. So when your enemies wanted to twist the knife, they didn't need to invent new symbolism, they just perverted the ones you already owned. Enter the genre of bestial burlesque. Yes, it's a thing. In 18th century France, a subset of erotic satire flourished that depicted royals and nobles involved in increasingly bizarre sexual scenarios, often involving animals. Lions for strength, dogs for loyalty, pigs for gluttony, and horses for unbridled lust. These stories weren't meant to be taken seriously, they were exaggerated to the point of grotesque. But once you were cast in one of these tales, once your name was linked to that imagery, it stuck like tar on silk. This brings us to the scholarly debate. Was French satire about Catherine just garden variety Enlightenment raunch, or was it a calculated political tool? Some argue it was all just entertainment, that mocking royals, especially foreign ones, was the national pastime. Catherine's power, age, and endless stream of lovers made her perfect comedic material. But others see something darker. A deliberate campaign of slander from rival nations who couldn't compete with your intellect or military strength, so they turned to sexual humiliation instead. France, after all, wasn't exactly thrilled about your rise. You outmaneuvered them in diplomacy, expanded your empire, and supported Enlightenment ideas without spiralling into revolution. In some ways, you became what France wanted to be, but couldn't, so they mocked you, not for your failures, but for your success. And here's the kicker. Even French feminists of the time didn't always come to your defense. You were too complicated, too powerful, too unapologetic. You weren't suffering under the weight of patriarchy, you were striding across it in riding boots. That made you harder to rally behind, so they stayed cynical, or joined in the mockery, because nuance rarely survives in satire. Quirky little aside. One French poem from 1795 features a talking horse named Volontaire, who recounts his service to the Tsarina, ending with the line, "Her appetite was noble, but her methods were equine." It was passed around as a joke in cafes. It later appeared in an anthology of political bestiaries. Again, fiction, but with a very real consequence. Because the joke, once told enough, stopped being a joke. It became folklore, and folklore, as we've seen, doesn't require facts. It requires rhythm. And the Catherine the Horse story has rhythm in spades. It has drama, humiliation, forbidden pleasure, and death by absurdity, all wrapped in a narrative too shocking not to repeat. And that's why the French helped shape the legend more than any other nation. Because they were the loudest, the wittiest, the most willing to take an intellectual and twist them into a scandal. Voltaire praised you, but the generation after him took that praise and curdled it into parody. Diderot met you and admired your mind, but that didn't stop his readers from speculating what else you'd shown him. So when the horse rumour finally crossed borders, into Britain, Germany, and eventually America, it wasn't smuggled in like poison, it was exported like fashion, made in France. And once it landed, it galloped, because the lie was already wearing a powdered wig, sipping brandy, and laughing into its lace handkerchief. So let's get to the part everyone thinks they know: your death. After all, that's the core of the legend, right? That's the dark, perverse cherry on top of the scandal sundae. You didn't just live outrageously. You didn't just love too much, or too wildly, or too young. No, you died in the most humiliating, shocking, and absolutely fictional way possible. Because when people can't destroy you in life, they save their worst venom for the epilogue. But the real story is far less dramatic, and somehow that only made the lie more appealing. Historical fact: you died on November 17th, 1796, in the Winter Palace. You were 60 years old and had been empress for 34 years, making you one of the longest reigning monarchs in Russian history. That morning you rose early, habitual of course, and collapsed in your private bathroom. A stroke. Not unusual for someone of your age, particularly after a lifetime of relentless work, emotional strain, and the general toll of running the world's largest empire. You were carried, unconscious, to your bed. You never woke up. No fanfare, no mechanical harness, no tragic hooves stomping off into history. Just a body finally giving out after holding up an empire for 3 decades. And yet somehow within days, the whispers began. Not just the usual palace gossip, who would rule next, what would happen to your unfinished reforms, but something stranger, quieter, like a dirty secret passed behind gloved hands. "She didn't die of a stroke," someone muttered. "No," said another, lowering their voice. "It was something else. An accident." Then came the punchline. "She was found under a horse." That's how it started, not with a headline, but with a joke. One told just barely out of earshot of decorum, one so shocking, so absurd that it had to be repeated. And the more it was repeated, the more it changed. By the 1800s, it had already transformed. Now you were no longer simply found dead. It was a contraption, a custom-built machine, a device of perversion. Some whispered it was your idea, others claimed it was your staff's. No one could explain how it worked, but they described it anyway in lurid detail, as if engineering had nothing on imagination. Quirky fact: the earliest written version of the death by horse story doesn't appear until 1834, in a British political satire journal that made no attempt to verify the claim. It was placed in a section called Courtly Curiosities, wedged between a joke about the Prince Regent's waistline and an obviously fake story about a Bavarian noblewoman who married a tree. You were, from the start, included for shock value, for laughs, and yet within decades the story had spread into places it never should have reached. You were mentioned in serious volumes, encyclopedias, political anthologies, even lecture notes, often with a sly asterisk or footnote that hinted at unconfirmed rumours, or the darker whispers of her final moments. Some writers called it a bizarre accident, others left it vague. Her death remains the subject of colourful speculation. You became a trivia question, a barroom anecdote, a joke people told not to believe but to feel clever repeating. The details were fuzzy, but the image was unforgettable. And that's what made it dangerous, because no matter how many doctors signed your death certificate, no matter how carefully the palace tried to control the narrative, it couldn't compete with the spectacle of your alleged demise. A horse, a harness, an empress crushed beneath her own lust. No one cared if it was true. They only cared that it sounded like something someone like you might do. Which is, of course, the whole point. Here's the scholarly debate of the hour. Did the story persist because of misogyny, or because of the sheer, absurd magnetism of the image itself? Some say it was purely a gendered smear, that no man in your position would ever have been saddled, pun fully intended, with such a vile postscript, and that your sexual agency, long treated as scandalous, made people eager to believe the worst. Others argue that the story's survival has less to do with you, and more to do with how gossip spreads. That the more grotesque and surreal a rumour is, the more it clings to the cultural memory. The truth? Probably both. Because yes, the rumour reflects deep misogyny. A woman dies after decades of power, and instead of celebrating her legacy, the world conjures up a death so humiliating it essentially rewrites her entire life. But it also reflects something simpler, a culture addicted to the outrageous, to the forbidden, to the punchline that comes with a gasp. It's why this story never really dies. It's too shocking to ignore, too funny, in that awful dark way, too easy to whisper at a party and pretend you're just joking. But let's zoom in on what actually happened in the days after your death. Your son, Paul I, took the throne, and despite his personal hatred for you, despite years of believing you stole his birthright, he didn't deny you a royal burial. You lay in state dressed in white and gold, guarded by the elite regiments you had once commanded. Nobles filed past in solemn silence. The clergy prayed, foreign dignitaries bowed. And behind the scenes, Paul was already rewriting your policies. You were interred with full honours next to Peter III, the husband you may have helped remove. A final, pointed gesture from a bitter son trying to restore his father's ghost to history. But even Paul, for all his loathing, never dared to say what the rumours claimed. He undid your reforms, but he didn't speak the lie out loud, because even he knew it was ridiculous. Still, the Whisper campaign did its work. Long after you were gone, the scandal became the story. It overrode your victories, your laws, your art, the letters you exchanged with Voltaire, the school children you educated, the lands you added to the empire. It flattened your legacy into a single obscene anecdote, one that says more about the people who repeat it than the woman it was about. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that the rumour exists, but that it lasted. That something so impossibly stupid could outlive something so extraordinary. But then again, you always knew how fickle the world could be. You once wrote, "A great wind is required to move a ship. A faint whisper will topple a woman's name, and the wind is still blowing. By now, the damage is done." The horse joke isn't just lingering in some shady corner of court gossip. It's galloping through history, saddled with bad intent and completely unstoppable. It's like a terrible meme before memes existed. And no matter how many scholars try to swat it down with logic or documented autopsies or, physics, the thing just refuses to die. It's folklore now, sticky, stubborn, and weirdly funny to the kind of people who laugh at fart jokes and historical fiction written in crayon. And the worst part? It doesn't stay buried. Generation after generation, someone picks it up again. They dust it off, laugh about it like it's a fun party fact, and pass it along as if they're handing over a nugget of secret knowledge. You become that figure people snicker about in high school history class or drunkenly mention in dorm rooms. "Hey, did you hear about the Empress who..." And then the lie gets dragged out one more time like a bad party trick, a grotesque icebreaker. But this isn't just a funny rumour that overstayed its welcome. It's the prototype for a very particular kind of character assassination. The kind that turns a towering figure into a cartoonish footnote. What was once a respected empress, an Enlightenment-era powerhouse, becomes the setup for a sick punchline. And the audience? They're everyone who ever felt vaguely uncomfortable with a woman holding power and enjoying herself. It's like the world looked at your 34-year reign, your sweeping legal reforms, your successful wars, your alliances with Enlightenment thinkers, your cultural renaissance, and said, yeah, but what if... horse? Historical fact. By the late 19th century, the joke had become so common that even relatively serious historical texts felt the need to address it. Some refuted it directly. Others awkwardly acknowledged it in the footnotes, not wanting to lend it weight, but knowing that readers might already have heard the story. You were, by this point, both a serious monarch and a walking dirty joke, which is a very strange legacy to balance. And here's a particularly bizarre quirk. There were products sold in your name unofficially that leaned into the myth. In 1887, a French absinthe label ran a short-lived series called Les Grandes Infâmes, with bottles named after notorious historical figures. Catherine's bottle featured a horse on the label. No description, just the animal. That's how deeply embedded the rumour had become. It didn't need explaining. One hoofed silhouette said it all. And it's not just Europe keeping the tale alive. By the 20th century, American pulp novels and low-budget history magazines were all over it. One particularly tasteless edition of Scandalous Monarchs, printed in the 1950s, featured a section titled The Empress and the Stallion. It was supposedly non-fiction. The author, whose academic credentials included exactly nothing, claimed to have found secret Russian court documents confirming the tale. Of course, these documents were never produced, but by then who cared? The headline was what sold. This is the era when the story gets legs, haunches even, because it isn't just a whisper anymore, it's mainstream, still tongue-in-cheek, sure, but now it's part of the pop culture bloodstream. something people assume must have at least a kernel of truth, even if they're not quite sure what or where or why. It's been repeated enough that challenging it feels like challenging gravity, and so it spreads. Even now, in the 21st century, you can find the rumour resurfacing every time someone Googles your name. It pops up on Reddit threads, joke Twitter accounts, listicles with titles like 10 historical figures who died the weirdest deaths. You're sandwiched between the guy who supposedly choked on a turtle and the woman who married the Eiffel Tower. Classy company. This is where the modern debate comes in. Should we still be laughing? On one hand, the story is so obviously false, so cartoonishly grotesque that people argue it's harmless. A dark joke about an era long gone. A meme from a time before memes. On the other hand, it's not just a joke. It's a joke with a body count. Your reputation, your legacy. Every time someone leads with the horse, they erase everything else you built. They reduce you to something base and grotesque. And they don't even realise they're doing it. There's a whole scholarly subfield now, yes, so really dedicated to the study of how female leaders are remembered differently than men. The language used, the metaphors, the focus. And guess what? Sexual rumours are almost always part of the pattern. Elizabeth verse, secret pregnancies. Cleopatra, death by erotic snake. Anne Boleyn, witch, marks and incest. And you? Well, we've established that one. So here's the big, ugly truth. The rumour works because it sounds like a punishment. A punishment for being powerful, for being sexual, for enjoying anything too much. You didn't die because of a horse, but it feels right to people who think that's what you deserved. As if pleasure, ambition, and command in a woman must eventually turn into tragedy. That deep down she must destroy herself with her own hunger. It's not just misogyny. It's literary tradition, quirky detail. There's an entire subreddit today where users create fake, historical deaths that slap, and you show up constantly. Usually in terrible memes. One of the most upvoted posts features your face photoshopped onto a centaur with the caption, "Didn't die with a horse, died as one." It's dumb, it's cruel, and it's par for the course. Because the story has been running so long it doesn't need fact-checking. It's beyond debunking. It exists in that weird cultural space where things are true enough to keep retelling, even when everyone involved knows they're fake. And so here we are. You're dead. The empire has passed into other hands, the map has changed, the language, the politics, the fashion, everything is different. But the rumour? The horse? That's still trotting along like it's on parade. Covered in dust but still grinning, because history forgets slowly. But a dirty joke, that gets remembered forever. It's one thing for a rumour to spread in whispers, in smoky salons or between the pages of underground pamphlets, but it's something else entirely when it enters the realm of print for profit. Because once you start showing up in erotica, and not the Shakespearean kind, but the dime store sweaty-palmed, must-be-over-18 to purchase kind, there's no turning back. You, Catherine the Great, were once an empress of letters and law. Now you're a category, a subgenre, a marketing hook in the oldest business in publishing, pornography. Welcome to the 1800s, where printers with loose morals and looser legal oversight realised something that would haunt your legacy forever. Scandal sells. And sex scandal? That's gold. Historical fact, in the 19th century, as industrial printing became faster and cheaper, there was an explosion of erotic literature across Europe. Much of it was published anonymously, without dates or publishing houses, to avoid prosecution. These weren't elaborate stories with plot and character development. They were vehicles for shock, and one of the most reliable names to slap on the cover was yours. You became the star of stories like The Imperial Desires of Catherine the Great, The Tsarina's Secret Stables, and Memoirs of a Northern Courtesan, titles that sold themselves with no pretense of history or even decency. You were depicted not as a ruler, but as a voracious libertine whose throne was apparently upholstered in satin and sin. These weren't even pretending to be biographies. They were fantasies, distorted, eroticized, cruel ones, where you were either the seductress, the victim, or the perverse punchline. The horse by this point was a fixture. No longer just a rumour, it became part of a manufactured identity, grotesque shorthand. Sometimes the rumour showed up at the end of a lurid story like a twist ending. And then, unable to be satisfied by men, the Empress turned to... Other times it was the whole point of the book. The hook. The shock value that guaranteed sales. A mechanical contraption was often described, sometimes in alarmingly specific terms, as if the authors had blueprints and degrees in engineering kink. They didn't. But again, no one was reading these for technical accuracy. Here's your quirky fact. In 1809, a banned French novel titled L'Écurie de l'Impératrice, The Empress's Stable, was confiscated by police after being found in the personal collection of a duchess. The novel featured a heavily fictionalized Katerina who throws lavish orgies in a barn-themed palace wing. It included scenes of her training guards in the arts of endurance and concluded with her building a mechanical device to marry the beast within. Despite being illegal, copies were reprinted and sold privately for decades. It's worth noting that this wasn't just some weird little footnote in publishing history. These works were influential. They were read by bored aristocrats, soldiers, university students, and eventually psychologists. Which means, yes, some of the earliest thinkers in sexology and psychiatry encountered your story through erotica. They weren't studying you, they were studying the myth. And sometimes they confused the two. That's where the lines started to blur, even for educated people. If you'd heard the story, seen it repeated in multiple books, and talked about it over port in your private club, didn't that make it kind of true? Maybe not historically true, but symbolically true? And if it was symbolically true, wasn't that worse? Because now, it wasn't just that you were rumoured to have died in some perverse accident, it was that your name now meant something obscene, something dark, something people wouldn't say aloud in mixed company, but still smiled about, knowingly. And that's how you went from Empress to erotica. It wasn't even mad personal. That's the sad part. It was business. Which brings us to the scholarly debate of this section. Was your transformation into a pornographic figure an act of cultural cruelty, or simply the cost of celebrity? There are historians who argue that, like all larger-than-life figures, you were bound to be fictionalized. That the pornographers didn't hate you, they needed you. They borrowed your name the way filmmakers borrow Cleopatra's eyeliner. You became an avatar for fantasies, not because of who you were, but because of what you represented. Power, mystery, danger, and the unspeakable. You were, in a way, perfect. Others push back hard against that interpretation. They argue that what happened to your legacy wasn't mere distortion, it was erasure. That the pornographic rebranding of your image made it impossible for future generations to engage with your actual accomplishments. That every time a student rolls their eyes at your name, they're not reacting to your Enlightenment philosophy, they're reacting to the myth that was sold in brown paper wrappers 100 years ago. And let's not kid ourselves, those books didn't just reflect cultural anxieties, they shaped them. They helped codify the idea that women in power were inherently unnatural. That sexuality in a queen was dangerous. That desire, when female, would always spiral into perversion. It's not just what the book said, it's what they taught their readers to believe. The legacy you built, brick by legislative brick, law by law, battle by battle, was smothered under cheap stories and crude illustrations. The state you modernized, the people you educated, the courts you reformed, reduced to the setting for a fetish. It's not just disrespect, it's historical vandalism. Quirky add-on, in the early 1900s, a parody opera was staged in Vienna called Katharina and the Cavalier, where the main joke was a recurring musical motif, neighing. The audience roared with laughter every time the Empress entered, and a faint whinny played in the background. The music wasn't brilliant, the script was worse, but it was a hit. The myth, now in musical form, had an encore, and so it continued. Decade after decade, your name remained bound to stories you never lived, written by men who never knew you, for readers who cared more about titillation than truth. You were no longer a person, you were an icon, warped, eroticized, and plastered on the cultural wall with a note that read, "Caution, may contain excessive power." Because that's what it always comes back to. This isn't just about sex, or scandal, or a stupid joke that went too far. It's about what happens when a woman refuses to be small. When she rules without apology. When she outlives her enemies and dies in her own bed, having left the world visibly different than she found it. They couldn't defeat you in life, so they tried to humiliate you in death. With ink, with fiction, with filth, and unfortunately, they sold a lot of copies. Imagine this. A room filled with tweed jackets and elbow patches, pipe smoke curling through the air, and the low hum of an academic conference where every panel promises the same thing, serious scholarship. And now picture the moment when a historian, voice carefully neutral, clears their throat and says, "Of course we must address the rumour about the horse." That's it. That's the vibe. You, Catherine the Great, are still haunting the ivory towers, not just as a ruler, not just as a political theorist or cultural reformer, but as that one monarch with the rumour. Even the serious historians have to tiptoe around it, as if they're obligated to say, yes, we've heard the filth. No, we're not amused, but let's just clear it up again for the record. And so here we are. Welcome to the eye-roll edition of your legacy. This is where the scholars get out their pens, not to romanticise or eroticise, but to correct, to annotate, to shove the rumour back into the gutter it crawled out of. And believe me, they've tried. Over and over and over. Because unlike the people who invented the myth for laughs or sales, these are the ones who genuinely care about the truth. And they are tired. Historical fact. From the mid-20th century onward, historians have consistently and emphatically debunked the horse rumour in virtually every serious biography written about you. In academic circles, it's referred to as the Catherine Scandal myth, or sometimes just the lie. Entire chapters are often dedicated to unpacking not only the fact that it's false, but the why people believed it, how it was weaponised, and what it says about history's treatment of powerful women. Some scholars go further, suggesting that the very persistence of the myth says more about us, the readers, the historians, the meme makers, than it does about you, because we know better. We've known better for a long time, and yet, even among the most educated, the rumour floats like a dead fish just beneath the surface. And that's where the frustration sets in. Quirky fact, in 1974, a respected Russian historian included an entire appendix in their biography of you titled The Horse Lie. It was a 10-page rant, not even politely academic, absolutely furious at having to spend time discussing the rumour in the first place. The tone was basically, this is idiotic and I cannot believe I'm writing this, but here we are. The scholar even footnoted other scholars who were equally appalled. It was a group therapy session disguised as research, but for every serious attempt to kill the lie, there's another problem, the internet. Because now, any middle schooler with Wi-Fi can type your name into a search bar and within seconds find some half-literate comment thread declaring, "Didn't she die by getting crushed by a horse?" And just like that, another loop is added to the cycle. One more uninformed post, one more snide joke, one more shrugging. Well, that's what I heard. This is where the modern scholarly debate picks up steam. The question isn't just, is the rumour false? That part is easy. The question is, why is it still believed even in the face of absolute, clear, exhaustively repeated evidence to the contrary? And the answer grimly is this, because truth has to be taught. Lies, meanwhile, just have to be repeated, which is what makes this particular rumour so tenacious. It doesn't require thought. It doesn't even require memory. It just needs to be retold in the right voice, with a wink or a grin or an emoji, and it sticks like bubblegum under the desk of history. Even people who know better sometimes laugh, sometimes repeat it themselves, not because they believe it, but because it's a convenient shorthand for, oh, you know her, that one. This frustrates historians to no end, because your reign, your actual reign, was groundbreaking. You weren't just a competent ruler, you were exceptional. You expanded the Russian Empire, overhauled the legal system, modernised education, patronised the arts and communicated directly with the greatest thinkers of your time. You did more in a decade than most monarchs do in a lifetime. And yet, the horse. It's not just unfair, it's infuriating. One respected biographer described your legacy as 2 layers, the crown and the caricature. The crown is your real history, your reforms, your wars, your diplomacy. The caricature is the lie, the one that clings to the edge of every article, every documentary, every classroom where the teacher has to pause and say, okay, let's just get this out of the way first. And yet, despite the frustration, there's something strangely revealing about this persistence. It exposes a truth about how we remember people, especially women. The facts are not enough. The truth needs constant defence. It needs repeating. Because if you don't push back, the lie becomes what survives. Quirky moment in academia. In 2011, a university history professor was giving a lecture on the Enlightenment and mentioned you, briefly as part of a larger section on monarchs and modernity. Before she could move on, a student raised his hand and, with absolute sincerity, asked, "So was the horse thing, like, symbolic?" The professor had to take a full 10 minutes to explain that no, it wasn't symbolic. It wasn't real. It wasn't anything. Just trash dressed up as folklore. The room laughed, but the point was made. Even educated people, even people interested in history, still carry the myth, like gum on their shoe. And this brings us to the most painful truth of all: debunking the rumour doesn't undo the damage. The lie leaves a stain, a shadow. Even when people know it isn't true, they remember it as if it could be. It's always lurking in the background, reducing everything else you did to a grotesque footnote. That's what historians hate most, because they don't just care about truth, they care about memory, about justice, about making sure the people who actually did remarkable things are remembered for those things, not reduced to someone else's dirty punchline. And you, Catherine, deserve better. You deserve to be remembered as a reformer, a writer, a builder, a political giant. You deserve footnotes about legal codes and economic policy, not barn animals. You deserve to have your name spoken in the same breath as Frederick the Great or Maria Theresa or Peter the Great, not because of some sick, stupid rumour, but because you ruled with a kind of clarity and vision most leaders could only dream of. And yet here we are, still explaining, still clarifying, still saying, no, that's not how she died. But maybe, just maybe, the more we say it, the more it sticks. Maybe the next student who raises their hand won't ask about the horse. Maybe they'll ask about the nakaz, or the expansion of Russian education, or your letters to Voltaire. Maybe the crown will win, eventually. Let's take a moment to talk about image control, the ancient art of scrubbing, spinning, and reshaping reputations before they rot in the public eye. Today, we call it public relations. Back in your day, Catherine, it was a little messier. There were no press secretaries, no PR firms or damage control consultants with PowerPoints and sad coffee. But even in the 18th century, when gossip galloped faster than couriers and scandal was carved into dinner conversations, rulers knew how to polish their own legend. And you practically invented the imperial PR machine. You understood early and instinctively that a ruler wasn't just a person. You were a brand, a narrative, a walking monument. Your enemies could attack your policies, your lovers, even your gender, but not if you stayed one step ahead. So you turned the palace into a theatre. You made your public appearances count. You mastered the art of the portrait, the speech, the symbolic gesture. You curated your myth in real time, framing yourself not only as Russia's empress, but as her mother, her philosopher, her sword, and it worked, for a while. Historical fact: Catherine was one of the first monarchs to actively commission paintings, busts, and literary works that elevated her image beyond the throne. She wrote plays, yes, plays, often filled with veiled references to virtue, enlightenment, and political harmony. She employed artists from France and Italy to create flattering portraits, even overseeing how she was posed. Always regal, always composed, never passive, never prey. You even managed your correspondence like press releases. Your letters to Voltaire were filled with carefully chosen phrases, not just for him but for posterity. You knew those words would outlive both of you, so you made sure they told the right story. Catherine the thinker, the modernizer, the benevolent monarch. But then the scandal fog rolled in. The rumours started multiplying like weeds, choking out the flowers you'd spent decades planting, and for the first time, your control began to slip. That's when the Romanovs stepped in. After your death, your successors inherited not just your empire, but your public image. And, surprise, they didn't exactly protect it. Your son Paul Verters, still bruised from a lifetime of being sidelined, took a hammer to your legacy almost immediately. He reversed your policies, undid your reforms, and buried your old enemy/husband Peter III next to you as one final insult. But he didn't just attack your politics, he targeted your memory. The Imperial Archives were suddenly less generous with your documents. Your personal letters were locked away or edited indeed. Some biographies of you, especially in Russia, became carefully censored works of fiction, either glorifying you to sainthood or erasing your complexity altogether. And as the decades passed, the Imperial PR machine that should have protected your legacy did the opposite. They tried to clean it up by pretending the messy parts never existed. Here's your quirky fact. In the early 1800s, a Russian librarian tasked with organising your personal correspondence to foreign monarchs supposedly burned several letters that contained unseemly language or references to courtly affairs. We don't know what those letters said, we probably never will, but it tells you something that the people responsible for preserving your story were already editing you down to something they found more palatable. And while they were busy trimming, censoring and polishing, the rest of Europe was not. The rumour machine outside Russia kept cranking. France, Britain, even the newly forming United States. Each took turns mythologizing you in their own way. sometimes as a brilliant philosopher queen, sometimes as a deranged dominatrix with a saddle collection. The Romanovs failed to counter those narratives, either because they were too embarrassed, too disinterested, or, in some cases, maybe even a little amused. So while your memory was slowly being whitewashed domestically, it was being set on fire internationally. And here's the real kicker. No empire-wide, organised effort ever truly stepped in to say, this horse rumour is absolute nonsense. Not the way they would have for a male ruler. There were no decrees denouncing the slander, no urgent state-sponsored histories to correct the lie, no monuments erected to clarify the dignity of your death. Why? Because the lie was already known. Because it had become a kind of off-the-books consensus. Everyone knew it wasn't true. But no one wanted to waste political capital defending the honour of a woman who had ruled alone, loved freely, and refused to be ashamed of either. That's silence. That was complicity. So the PR machine that should have worked in your favour, the one that had elevated you to a goddess during your reign, betrayed you after death by not fighting hard enough to protect your truth. And the longer that silence stretched, the more the myth settled into the dust of history. Here's where scholars argue. Did the Romanovs deliberately allow the rumour to spread to undermine your legacy? Was it a passive failure or an active strategy? Some believe Paul wanted revenge and that letting the world remember you as an unhinged nymphomaniac was a convenient way to overshadow your accomplishments. Others think it was simple aristocratic cowardice, unwillingness to engage in vulgar gossip, even if that meant letting it fester. Either way, the result was the same. You were erased by neglect. And when that kind of vacuum opens up around a figure as large as you, someone will fill it. And that someone, in this case, was a crowd of hacks, pamphleteers, armchair philosophers, erotic fiction writers, and crude cartoonists. Your image, once so carefully curated, was now up for auction. And to make matters worse, the myth was so juicy, so ludicrous, that future Romanovs couldn't kill it even if they tried. By the late 19th century, you were the empress people secretly giggled about in letters, the subject of half-true history books, one-act plays, and satirical operas. Your reforms, your diplomacy, your wars, they all came second to the scandal. Even Russian school books walked a careful line. They taught your achievements, but often with a faint embarrassed air, as if to say, yes, she did great things. But let's not get into it. So the empire you ruled did what so many empires do when faced with a powerful woman's legacy. It minimized, sanitized, and silently hoped the world would forget the messy parts. But the world didn't forget. It remembered exactly what it wasn't supposed to. Because that's how rumours work. They survive not through truth, but through repetition and neglect. And your legacy, it was managed too little, too late. Now we're heading into murky waters. Diaries. Or to be more specific, the things that claim to be diaries. Because for every real journal locked in a library vault, there's another document out there that winks just a little too hard, written in a voice that sounds suspiciously modern, and filled with details no real person would ever bother to jot down unless they were trying to titillate a reader 200 years in the future. You, Catherine the Great, are a favourite target for these kinds of writings, which is no surprise. After all, when a ruler becomes a rumour, it only takes one forged page to turn gossip into evidence. Let's start with the real ones, your actual writings. And yes, you were a prolific writer, not just politically, though that was a full-time job on its own, but personally, too. Letters, memos, essays, reflections. You were in many ways a monarch by day and a philosopher by candlelight. You corresponded with intellectuals across Europe. You wrote about law, education, serfdom, and the future of Russia. Your nakaz, a document you wrote to guide legal reform, was over 500 pages long and argued radically at the time that no one, not even the Tsarina, should be above the law. Historical fact. Catherine's genuine writings are carefully preserved in Russian archives and European collections. Many of your letters to Voltaire and Diderot have been published and studied for centuries. They're clear, witty, sharp. Your handwriting was neat, your tone confident, and your favourite topic, no surprise, was power. How it should be used, when it goes wrong, and how it must be earned. No talk of orgies, no confessionals, no stool metaphors, just philosophy and statecraft. But then there are the other writings, the ones that suddenly appeared in the 19th century, long after your death, written in what can only be described as uncomfortably imaginative prose. These alleged diaries are almost always anonymous discoveries, found in private estates, or translated from conveniently missing originals. And their content? Equal parts erotica, fantasy, and absurdity. Quirky fact, one of the most infamous Catherine diaries was published in Paris in 1806 under the title Journal intime de l'impératrice C. The author claimed it was a translation of your secret journals smuggled out of Russia by a French maid who had been present at court. The book includes entries like, "Tonight, Grigory wore only his medals and a smile," and "The new guard is tall and obedient, perhaps too obedient." It was, of course, completely fake, but it sold extremely well. That forgery, and others like it, were part of a literary trend in the late 19th century, the fictional confessional. Fake memoirs became a genre of their own, especially when they were salacious. Publishers knew that a scandal wrapped in the illusion of intimacy was irresistible. And what better subject than the famously uncontrollable Empress of Russia? These diaries painted you not as a strategist or a reformer, but as an insatiable romantic who couldn't go a day without seducing a footman, scribbling about it in detail, and then making clever puns about your own body. The tone? A weird mix of Victorian repression and adolescent fantasy. Think Bridgerton, if written by a conspiracy theorist with too much brandy and zero understanding of geopolitics. Scholarly debate. Do any of these supposed personal writings have any merit? Have we ever found a document that might have been real, then spiced up later? The answer, probably not. Historians are pretty united here. These intimate diaries are almost personally complete fabrications. Even the ones that include mundane entries, "The samovar was late today, most displeased," always end up careening into melodrama and sweaty metaphors. There's no chain of custody, no paper trail, and most suspicious of all, the supposed handwriting never matches yours. But it's not just the forgery that frustrates historians. It's the credibility people give them. Because these fake diaries have been cited, yes, cited in newspaper articles, documentaries, and even academic papers by people too lazy or too excited to check the source. Some editions don't even bother to call them fiction. They're marketed as forgotten pages of royal history, as if they were found under your bed and not invented in a Montmartre wine bar by someone who just wanted to write about bustiers and horsewhips. What's more bizarre, some of these fake diaries tone down the horse rumour, replacing it with a series of coded references or mysterious euphemisms. One diary describes a midnight ride with an unnamed beast, and leaves the rest to the reader's imagination. Another suggests you had a mechanical device shaped like nobility itself, whatever that's supposed to mean. It's like fan fiction with a thesaurus. And here's the irony. The more fake these writings become, the more people believe them. Because they feel true. They're written in first person. They sound gossipy. They whisper to the reader, "You weren't supposed to see this." And for some, that's enough. The idea that you had a secret life hidden under layers of royal decorum is far more exciting than the documented truth of political savvy, diplomacy, and massive empire building. But the reality, you didn't need a secret diary to be fascinating. You lived out loud, you weren't shy, you weren't cloaked in mystery, you made your choices publicly, even defiantly. You appointed your lovers to high positions. You celebrated your intellectual circle. You published your essays. You weren't a recluse writing dirty poems in the dark, you were a stateswoman writing laws by daylight. And yet the fake diary persists. Why? Because it offers an easy escape from complexity. The real Catherine is a nuanced, towering figure who made both brilliant and brutal decisions. But the diary Catherine, she's simple, predictable, she just wants sex and power and more sex. She doesn't challenge readers, she indulges them, which again is the heart of the problem. The fake diary isn't about you at all, it's about what people want you to be, about how they feel safer turning you into a cautionary tale than confronting the uncomfortable truth, that a woman can be brilliant, ruthless, sexual, and successful, and not need to hide any of it. So what survives? The pages you wrote with purpose, or the ones they forged in your name, your words preserved in archives, are waiting. Your policies live on in a Russian law. Your vision for a literate, enlightened society shaped an empire. But the fake diary is probably being reprinted right now with a new introduction by someone who still thinks the horse rumour has merit. The choice is ours. Believe the writer, or believe the forgery. Let's take a breath. A deep one. You've been dead for over 200 years, your bones resting beneath the marble floors of the Peter and Paul Cathedral, and yet the gossip won't quit. The whispers still float through classrooms, living rooms, message boards, and whatever dark corner of YouTube someone's streaming half-baked conspiracy videos from. For all the ink spilled about your reforms, your wars, your intellect, your staggering influence, what most people remember is the rumour, the punchline, the meme. But the question that hangs over your legacy like fog over the Neva River is this: what actually lasts? Is it the empire you built, or the joke they built about you? You left a legacy most monarchs would kill for. You expanded Russia's borders by over 200,000 square miles. You turned a relatively backward nation into a major European power. You modernised agriculture, medicine, education, and the arts. You funded hospitals, founded schools for girls, opened libraries, commissioned operas, and gave peasants access to vaccines. Yeah, vaccines. Before most people knew what a germ was. You didn't just rule, you transformed. Historical fact, Catherine's Charter to the Nobility, issued in 1785, was a groundbreaking document. It guaranteed property rights, reduced arbitrary punishments, and solidified the legal role of the nobility in governance. It was one of the first attempts in Russian history to codify civil society, to separate the rule of law from the whims of absolute monarchy. You were truly trying to walk the tightrope between autocracy and Enlightenment ideals, and yet here we are, generations later, still wondering if people remember the governing or just the gossip. The truth? Most remember both, which is almost worse. You're a dual myth now, Catherine the Great, the Empress of Enlightenment, and Catherine the Great, the woman who supposedly couldn't be satisfied by men alone. It's like history split you in half, leaving your admirers clinging to the achievements and your detractors snickering at the scandal. That duality, regal on one side, raunchy on the other, is everywhere in your legacy. In museum exhibits that feature your letters next to portraits of your lovers, in textbooks that include your philosophical writings, with a footnote about the rumour for context. Even in pop culture, the contradiction is baked in. The powerful woman who ruled with reason, but was remembered with ridicule. Quirky fact, in 1996, Russia celebrated the 200th anniversary of your death. The event included academic conferences, museum retrospectives, commemorative coins, and a national television documentary. It was supposed to be a respectful, dignified remembrance, but in several news outlets covering the anniversary, the first sentence mentioned the horse, not your legal reforms, not your diplomacy, the rumour right at the top, as if history couldn't help itself, as if even in death you had to fight for the right to be taken seriously. So let's ask the question plainly. Did the scandal erase your accomplishments? No, not completely, but it distorted them. It turned every conversation about your brilliance into an awkward balancing act. Historians had to preface their praise with, of course there's the unfortunate legend, like your achievements came with a warning label, like your policies, your vision, your entire reign had to be held in one hand while the audience snuck glances at the horse in the other. The scandal didn't wipe you out, it blurred you. It made it harder to see the full shape of your life without also seeing the shadow. And the worst part? It's so familiar. You're not the only woman to have her legacy hijacked by scandal. Think of Marie Antoinette, turned into a cupcake-chomping caricature, or Cleopatra, remembered more for who she seduced than the empire she led, or Anne Boleyn, reduced to the woman with 6 fingers and a temper. It's a pattern so obvious you could set your sundial to it. When women rise too high, history doesn't just try to bring them down, it tries to embarrass them on the way out. Scholarly debate. Some modern historians argue that your sexual openness is what made your legacy so vulnerable. Not your power, but your refusal to be ashamed of pleasure. You didn't hide your lovers, you didn't apologise, you refused to fade into the background of your own reign. And that terrified people, so the lie became the leash. If they couldn't control you in life, they'd drag your memory down to the stable floor in death. Others argue that it was the scale of your power that made the scandal inevitable. You weren't just a ruler, you were the ruler. And not of a tiny duchy or decorative kingdom, but of an empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. You defeated Ottoman armies, you negotiated with Frederick the Great, you redefined Russian identity, and for some people, that was just too much for a woman to be. So they rewrote the ending. And now, centuries later, we're still stuck between the two Catherines, the empress and the myth, the strategist and the spectacle, the builder of empires and the subject of jokes. And yet, there's hope in the fact that we're still talking about you. Because the people who reduce you to a rumour, they're not winning, not completely. The historians are pushing back, the scholars are writing books, giving lectures, making documentaries that show the full you, not the punchline but the policymaker. And they're not the only ones. Artists, teachers, filmmakers, students, they're rediscovering the woman behind the myth. You're being reclaimed. Slowly, steadily, proudly, because no matter how loud the lie is, the truth has staying power. The truth wears boots, it rides long distances, it builds institutions, it outlasts slander. And you, Catherine the Great, were never built for small stories. You were built for empires. You've ruled, you've reformed. You've been slandered beyond all recognition. But if you thought your journey ended in the 18th century, think again. Because the strange afterlife of your legacy has taken a turn so bizarre and glitter-covered, even you, with your flair for spectacle, might have raised an eyebrow. Welcome to the world of Catherine the Great in pop culture, where history meets binge-watch, and the line between fact and farce becomes more blurred than a Baroque oil painting in a Vegas gift shop. First things first, let's give credit where it's due. Your name still draws a crowd. People are fascinated by you. Not just the academic types or the political nerds, but the Netflix-watching, gossip-loving, historical drama binging masses. You've been portrayed by everyone from respected stage actresses to cheeky comedy leads. And no matter the version, you remain the ultimate drama queen, literally and figuratively. Historical fact, the earliest film depiction of you dates back to 1924 in The Eagle, a silent film starring Rudolph Valentino as a dashing officer who catches the Empress's eye. You're portrayed as seductive, powerful, and a little unhinged. No surprise there. That early portrayal set the tone for most future versions of you, a mix of lust, luxury, and absolute authority. The horse rumour isn't mentioned outright, but the tone is suggestive enough that audiences didn't need it spelled out. By the mid-20th century, you'd become a staple of costume drama. Hollywood loved you, but not for your legal reforms. No one was filming sweeping montages about the Nakaz. Instead, you were played as the icy, calculating woman with a decadent bedroom and an ever-rotating cast of uniformed men. Your court was depicted like Versailles on steroids. Jewels, wigs, powdered everything, and enough tension to light a chandelier with a glare. Then came the biopics, some respectful, some extremely not. In 1934, Marlene Dietrich stepped into your boots for The Scarlet Empress, which was basically a fever dream of Russian excess. You were painted as half saint, half seductress, with set designs that looked like a haunted cathedral made out of sex and gold. It was gothic. It was glamorous. It was so far from reality that even your ghost would have needed a drink just to get through the credits. Fast forward to the 21st century, and your name gets yet another makeover, this time in the form of sleek prestige television. Enter the Great, starring Elle Fanning as you, and Nicholas Hoult as a hilariously awful Peter III in a series that markets itself with the tagline, "An occasionally true story," emphasis on occasionally. Quirky fact. In the pilot episode of The Great, one of the first jokes is about the horse rumour. Not even 2 minutes in, and a character casually drops it like it's standard dinner party conversation. It's treated as a joke, because it is, but it also establishes right away that this version of your story knows what it's doing, playing with the myth while winking at the audience. That show, in all its wild irreverence, actually does something clever. It uses the rumour as a mirror, reflecting just how absurd the caricature of you has become. It doesn't believe the myth, but it knows the myth exists, and rather than ignore it, it drags it into the room, laughs at it, and moves on. Which weirdly is progress. Still, the damage lingers. Even in shows or films that don't explicitly mention the horse, the shadow's there. Your lovers are always exaggerated. Your power always framed as slightly suspect. There's almost always a sense that you're being judged not just by your subjects or your enemies, but by history itself. It's like every version of you on screen has to fight for legitimacy while still wearing 6 layers of lace and a smirk. Scholarly debate. Does pop culture help or hurt your legacy? It depends who you ask. Some historians argue that these portrayals, even the tongue-in-cheek ones, dilute your impact. They worry that viewers will come away thinking you are mostly about fashion and flirting and forget the empire building, the legal reforms, the Enlightenment correspondence. Others argue that any depiction, is better than silence. That shows like The Great introduce new audiences to your story, however messy, and invite curiosity. If a few viewers go from watching you on screen to Googling your actual accomplishments, then something's working. The real problem is when the joke becomes the story. When writers, screenwriters and content creators lean so hard into the scandal that they erase your substance, because you're more than a corset, more than a raised eyebrow and a flirtatious insult. You governed, you endured, you outmaneuvered nearly every man who tried to control you. You're not a plot device, you're the whole damn plot. Yet in meme culture and viral TikToks, the horse rumour still pops up like a bad penny, teens reenacted in parody skits. Comment sections light up with, "Didn't she die with a horse?" like it's breaking news. It's used for laughs, for likes, for shock, no context, no correction. Just that same tired joke galloping through another medium. Still, there are moments of redemption. In some modern media, you're shown in your full complexity. A woman of letters, a political animal, a strategist, a mother, a survivor. There's even a growing trend in feminist literature and theatre to reclaim your voice. Not the mythical Catherine, but the real one. The one who wrote essays on governance while nursing a migraine. The one who handled a continent's worth of politics with steel nerves and soft sarcasm. The one who lived boldly, unapologetically, and never once waited for permission. You're being remembered again. Not just replayed. Not just mocked. And maybe that's the best we can ask for in this strange afterlife of screens and stage lights. That in the blur between fact and fiction, between corsets and captions, the truth starts to leak through. Maybe the people laughing now will be the ones who go looking later. Maybe the myth is just the gateway. Because if pop culture has one redeeming trait, it's reach. It touches millions. And if even a fraction of those people end up wanting to know you, the real you, not the cartoon, then maybe the rumour doesn't win after all. Maybe the crown outshines the joke, eventually. So let's zoom out for a second. Because as absurd and cruel as the rumour about you may be, Catherine, you're not exactly standing alone in the hall of slandered monarchs. No, your story, gory gossip, sexual scandal, death turned into the spectacle, follows a weirdly predictable pattern. It's part of a long tradition, like royal bloodlines, but with way more innuendo and fewer coronation jewels. The truth is, you're part of an elite club no one wants to join. Rulers remembered more for whispered sins than documented triumphs. History is riddled with these twisted tales, some of them so outrageous they make your supposed equine escapades look almost quaint. Take Queen Elizabeth I, for instance. The Virgin Queen, right? Except that during her lifetime and for centuries after, people whispered that she had secret children, hidden pregnancies, illicit affairs with courtiers. Some said she was actually a man in disguise. Others claimed she died young and was replaced with a red-headed lookalike. Why? Because a powerful woman without a husband made people deeply uncomfortable, so they filled in the gaps with fiction. Historical fact. Even Julius Caesar, the eternal Roman golden boy, wasn't safe. He was nicknamed every woman's man and every man's woman by his contemporaries, implying that his ambitions weren't limited to politics. Ancient rivals accused him of being seduced by the king of Bithynia, because nothing said unfit to rule in Rome like rumours of being the passive partner in a same-sex relationship. It didn't matter that he reformed the calendar, conquered Gaul and built an empire. For some, he was just the guy with the unmanly reputation. Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake, which of course she never actually said. But the quote was sticky, scandalous and dismissive, so it stuck. Her reputation got even worse in pamphlets circulated around Paris, painting her as a depraved, wasteful sex fiend with a thing for her brother-in-law, her son's tutor, and sometimes, allegedly, the furniture. By the time the guillotine came, public opinion had already been sharpened. So no, your treatment, Catherine, isn't unique. It's just the most extreme version. Because where other rulers got whispers, you got a full-blown bestial myth. Where others were accused of adultery, you were accused of engineering equipment for a horse. That's not slander, it's industrial-strength historical vandalism. And it begs the question, why do people keep doing this? Why do powerful figures, especially powerful women, attract rumours that twist their sexuality into something monstrous or ridiculous? It's not just about scandal, it's about control. If people can't challenge your policies, they challenge your private life. They dig into your bedroom. They make up fantasies that shrink you down into something they can laugh at. Because if they can laugh, they don't have to be afraid. They don't have to admire. They don't have to admit you were smarter, faster, or more ruthless than anyone else on the throne. Quirky fact. In the 1800s, a fake biography of Pope Joan, a woman who allegedly disguised herself as a man and became Pope, was a European bestseller. Never mind that she probably never existed. The story gave readers exactly what they wanted. A scandalous legend about someone who dared to defy the rules. And when her story took a turn for the humiliating she supposedly gave birth mid-procession, it wasn't just dramatic, it was punishment disguised as narrative, just like your rumour. Because this isn't about truth. It never was. It's about narrative discipline. The idea that if someone gets too powerful, too admired, too hard to categorise, the public needs to bring them back down to a manageable size. And the best way to do that? Sex, scandal, something so weird, so taboo, that it rewires how we remember them. That becomes the first thing we think of when we hear their name. You know who else's story got warped by scandal? Rasputin. The man was a mystic, a healer, maybe even a con artist, but he certainly didn't have a magic penis. Yet that rumour has followed him for over a century or more, complete with fake relics in jars and museum tours that lean hard into the myth. No one talks about his theology or political influence, just his libido. Sound familiar? There's something especially cruel in how this erasure happens. Because it's not done with swords or poison or prisons, it's done with snickering, with jokes, with unverified footnotes and winking allusions, is a soft form of destruction, almost polite, and yet devastating. Scholarly debate. Some historians argue that these myths serve a purpose, that they act as cultural pressure valves, that we invent scandal about powerful people because we feel disempowered ourselves. By laughing at the high and mighty, we reclaim a sense of control. Others argue that this isn't catharsis, it's sabotage. That these stories don't just entertain, they replace. That every whispered lie nudges the real history further out of focus, until all that's left is the fiction. And for women in particular, the pattern is nearly mathematical. Powerful woman equals sexually suspect. If she's beautiful, she's slept her way to the top. If she's plain, she must be bitter or perverse. If she's smart, she's manipulative. If she enjoys sex, she's dangerous. If she doesn't, she's frigid. There is no version where she's simply as powerful without having to explain, excuse, or pay for it. So no, Catherine, you're not alone. You're just the most spectacular example of what happens when a woman refuses to play by the rules, refuses to apologise for her ambition, and dares to enjoy her power and her pleasure at the same time. You didn't make history comfortable. You made it complicated. And for some people, that was just too much. So they told a story. A stupid, disgusting, endlessly recycled story. Because to them, it was easier to believe in the horse than to believe in you. Here we are, finally face to face with the question no historian wants to admit they're obsessed with, but every tabloid, meme maker, late night comic and Reddit thread has already answered with an enthusiastic yes. And that question is, why does this rumour still work? Why does a grotesque, impossible, logistically baffling myth about a woman and a horse still have legs? Why, after centuries of serious scholarship, documentary footage, biographies, and classrooms full of sighing teachers saying, no, it's not true, do people still whisper it with a grin? Because here's the truth you probably already knew back in 1796. People love scandal. Not real scandal, mind you, the subtle kind, the complex kind, the kind full of nuance and political context. No, they like their scandal loud, graphic, and deeply stupid. The kind you don't have to think about. The kind that sticks in your head like a bad commercial jingle. And the more it flies in the face of reason, the more people believe it, because it's outrageous, because it shocks, and shock more than any footnote up to a crown or treaty is what endures. You knew this. You manipulated it in life. Gracefully, tactfully, like a queen who knew her own image was half her power. You played the part, the enlightened ruler, the patron of the arts, the lover of Voltaire and civic order. You told the world how you wanted to be seen, and they saw it. Until you were no longer around to protect that version of yourself. And that's when the other version took over. Historical fact. The horse rumour is still included in modern encyclopedias, granted under the falsehoods or legends section. But it's there. No other world leader in history, male or female, has a sex-death myth so persistent that it shows up in both high school jokes and scholarly appendices. Not Napoleon, not Alexander, not even Caligula. And that man tried to date his horse, but with you, Catherine, it's stuck. Why? Because you were powerful, independent, unapologetically sexual, because you didn't marry for love, because you made lovers of the men you found useful and dismissed the ones who weren't, because you ruled like a man and refused to behave like one. Because in the eyes of a deeply sexist world, that meant you had to be punished somehow. Not in life, you were too savvy for that. But in memory. The horse rumour is punishment through ridicule. It's history saying, you think you were so great, let's see how people remember you in 200 years. It's not just a dirty joke, it's a message. And that's the part that lingers. Because we're still living in a world that reflexively mocks powerful women. Just look around. Any woman who climbs too high gets the same playbook thrown at her. She's cold, she's crazy, she's hormonal, she's sleeping her way through the ranks. She's not what she seems. Catherine, you just got the deluxe version. The final boss of slut-shaming folklore. Quirky fact. In 2019, a Twitter thread about bizarre deaths in history went viral. And guess whose name was at the top of the list? That's right, you. With a 3-line summary, Catherine the Great died trying to have sex with a horse. No context, no correction. Over 100,000 likes. Because that's how fast a lie can travel when it fits the punchline. So, do we blame the internet? Sure, partially. But the internet is just the latest host for an old parasite. The horse rumour doesn't survive because of digital culture. It survives because it perfectly suits the way we consume information now. Fast, shocking, and consequence-free. It's a meme, a soundbite, a thumbnail with a stupid title like History's Freakiest Monarchs. But here's the turn, it only survives because we let it. And that's where the debate lives now. Not whether the story is true, it isn't, or whether it was engineered to humiliate, it was. But what we're supposed to do with it. Are we meant to keep telling it ironically? To laugh at it and then sigh? Of course it's not true. To treat it like one of those weird corners of history we can't clean up, so we just learn to live with it? Or are we meant to burn it down? There's a growing camp of historians, educators, artists, even internet influencers, who are choosing the latter. They're not just debunking the myth, they're dragging it into the light, exposing its purpose, its sexism, its violence, its stupidity. They're replacing it with your actual story. Gritty and complicated and fascinating. A story of war and law and vision and raw human power. And it turns out that story is even better than the lie. Because here's what your real legacy includes. You ruled the Russian Empire solo for over 3 decades. You were a child bride turned revolutionary. You navigated the most cutthroat court in Europe and came out on top repeatedly. You rewrote Russian law, fought wars, founded schools, patronized the arts, embraced science, expanded the empire, and shaped an entire generation of thought. And you did it while wearing corsets, battling migraines, and having to tolerate a parade of foreign diplomats who constantly underestimated you. You were, quite literally, one of the most effective monarchs in European history. And you didn't die under a horse. So here's the invitation. Let's stop laughing. Not because the lie doesn't still have shock value. Not because we can't take a joke. But because we've learned how to look closer. Because we've grown tired of history told by punchline. Because we're ready for complexity. And because maybe the best revenge you could have against centuries of slander is being remembered properly. The joke lasted longer than it should have. But it doesn't have to last forever. You've waited 29 years. You've been the empress and the myth. Maybe now, finally, you can just be the woman who ruled Russia better than any man before or after. Because that's the part worth repeating. So here we are, stretched out at the end of this long, strange, utterly mesmerising journey through myth, monarchical moyi, and some truly cursed rumours. You've seen Catherine the Great rise from obscure German princess to the absolute ruler of an empire, survive an unbearable marriage, overthrow a czar, run the Russian court like a one-woman enlightenment salon, and yes, grapple with a posthumous PR crisis that somehow involved a horse. But you made it. Through all of it, you, dear listener, stuck it out. 30 sections deep, a full voyage through power, propaganda, and the twisted game of historical memory. If you're still awake, honestly, I'm impressed. And if you're dozing off, that's okay too. Catherine wouldn't blame you. The court was exhausting, and even she knew how to shut the curtains and rest. What we've seen tonight is more than just a bizarre rumour's origin story. It's a cautionary tale about the stories we believe, the ones we repeat, and the ways we choose to remember greatness, especially when it comes wrapped in lace and crowned with a tiara. Catherine's real life was messier, sharper, and far more brilliant than any slander could ever suggest, but it's on us to keep that truth alive. So maybe next time someone brings up the horse with a smirk, you'll raise an eyebrow and say, "Did you know she reformed Russian law and wrote Enlightenment political theory?" And maybe, just maybe, the myth gets a little quieter. Now, close your eyes. Let the empire fade into moonlight. Let the marble halls and candlelit corridors drift into soft silence. You've walked beside a queen. You've seen history from the inside out. Sleep well, friend. You earned it.